Okay. Yes. So anyway, that's where to find them. Navigating to each individual one from the past meetups, which isn't the easiest thing to find a meetup. Unfortunately, they have everything oriented towards your future meetups on a group, not towards the past ones. But you can browse around and find it. And if you go to any one of them, you can find should be able to find the other ones from it. But I'll experiment a little bit, and that may be a little bit easier for me to find it as a publisher of that site than it is for you as just consumers of the site. But
yeah, so I just searched for Heidegger, Nietzsche, Jason, and it's
yes,
the first hit.
Wonderful, great.
That was on the YouTube.
On YouTube.
Yeah.
Beautiful, Jason. Okay. Heidegger.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Delightful.
All right, so we'll eventually have a whole series there.
Speaking of the magic that he just described to us happening on YouTube,
yes,
there is a new documentary on Netflix called The Social Network or something title like that. It's really a conspiracy report by some people that used to work at these companies, Facebook and Google. And what they're really talking about is an addiction that they've observed, especially among young kids. Now, if you're interested, it's on Netflix.
I don't. Too far afield. Too far afield.
Yeah. It's exactly similar to a story that Star Trek had about a decade ago.
Cool, but too far afield. Okay. So we're first of all some meta comments. We got this one to do today, and there's going to be one more session to cover the rest of this whole volume 4, part 1, because it's like 58 more pages. They're weighty pages, but I want to like do them together. We might take 3 weeks for that, just because 58 pages isn't that many pages, but it's pretty heavy material. But we can talk about whether I want 2 or 3 weeks for that. And then there's one more session will be needed for the part 2 of volume 4, which is its own separate, like 50-odd page essay.
Wait a minute. Then today we're doing 15 through 20.
Correct.
And then, so next week, what to see is 21 through 29 being the
correct.
56. Clear.
58 pages. Yep.
Clear.
So I'm saying that we will not break up the remaining, 8 or 9 chapters. We'll just do 21 through 29 together. Then we'll do part 2, not always been determined by the history of being, as one session, because that again is like 56 pages. So you've got a 58-page reading and a 56-page reading, and then we're done with the whole book, both volumes. So I want to then have one more session after that where we do some summing up, major themes, lessons, directions, etc. So that means roughly there's this session, and then in 3 more sessions we're going to be done with this whole. Go ahead, Joe.
Is there any value to us of reading David Farrell Kent's analysis at the end of the volume?
Read it on your own if you care. I don't think there's a ton of value in us going through it together.
Okay.
I'd rather go on to other originals, so to speak.
Yes, sure.
Okay, a fair question. So if those things are 2 or 3 weeks, right? We're looking at on the order of 3 more sessions on roughly end of October, beginning of mid-November, somewhere in that time frame being finished. I have 1 week of vacation in late October, which may cause 1 week of skip there or something. But roughly around end of October, mid-November, in that time frame, we should be done with this one. I already have an idea on what I might want to do next, which I can run by you guys at some point, but it's actually a book we talked about before, of Being and Some Philosophers by Gilson. If people are interested, I think that might be worth reading together.
I already bought the book based on your prior mentioning of it.
Right.
So did I.
Wonderful. And the point of that is, it's in a way it's easier material than Heidegger, Nietzsche. He's a historian of philosophy in a more mainstream tradition, if I can put it that way, less esoteric tradition, if I can put it that way. So in some ways it's less demanding. that does bring with it its own challenges because he's going over a lot of historical material, and also he frankly is not quite as weighty a thinker as Heidegger or Nietzsche is. So you have to, take what he says with, the requisite amount of salt. Places where not necessarily going to go along with his judgment on this historical figure he's talking about, et cetera. That comes up in anyone you're reading, obviously. But I'm just saying you have to do a little bit more of that with a Gilson caliber person who's going to give you a lot of useful scholarship and a lot of useful ways of thinking about the thing, but you're going to have a little bit more. Well, he's completely wrong about this problem, right? Anyway, but anyway, it's definitely a worthwhile book. So that's what I'm thinking of as potentially going to next. I do think that if we do that, it will take several sessions and it will start sometime in November. And I don't know that we'll get done with it by January. For Joe, for your scheduling, your seasonal scheduling.
I'm not doing that anymore.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, so not an issue.
I'm pleased with it also.
It's just for other people. Joe sometimes is unavailable from January to April for doing tax prep stuff, but he's not doing it now apparently. Okay, so wonderful. So we can just plow onto that whenever it comes up. Okay, that's some background things. I want to mention one other thing, which is that Pete in one of the questions in the chat asked for me to go over main themes of Heidegger and Nietzsche, overall intro or framing, something like that. I can do a little bit of that, but I want to say some of that for the summing up. We're just a few sessions away from having read the whole thing and being able to all react to it together. And it's natural for that whole session, 3 sessions from now, to be about that and nothing else. So it might derail us a little bit to, get to the lessons right before we, hear the whole take on, what the end of metaphysics means and all this in relation to Plato and that kind of stuff that you get in the very end of the next session. So don't want to steal too much thunder, if I can put it that way.
Fair enough. I since I wasn't in at the beginning, I didn't know if I'd missed an introductory framework for the book that you
I understand, and the answer is you probably did, but everybody came in at different times and or had missed skips along the way. Everybody's missed some. I didn't start with a grand, this is what it's all about. I started with a, it's important to have read this book for all sorts of reasons, which will become much more apparent after you've actually read it. So, okay. Anyway, that's just a bunch of throat clearing about things we're doing next, and as opposed to the stuff for this session. Any questions about that before we get into the meat of this one?
Oh, tell me again the name of the book, the next book.
Sure. It's called Being and Some Philosophers. The author is Etienne Gilson. That's Etienne, French name. Gilson is Gilson.
Is there a certain edition you were for pagination and such?
I'm currently reading the second edition, which came out in 52 or something. I guess the original edition was in 49. I don't know that there's many more editions than that. It's the kind of thing you'll find on Amazon used, typically, not new print. It's a, I don't know, 230-page book. Gilson himself is a Thomist, right? Meaning Thomas Aquinas is his sort of background favorite philosopher, but he's doing some history of philosophy that goes all the way back to the Greeks, pre-Socratic Greeks, Plato and Aristotle, and through to some modern stuff, including Descartes and some existentialism, earlier existentialism, by the later parts of the book. So you get this sweeping history of philosophy with the general subject being about being and existence, problem of existence or existence distinguished from essence, through that whole history, so to speak. And one of the reasons I think this is useful is you get to see sort of what the traditional take on what Heidegger would call the problem of being is, because Heidegger likes to say, no one before me raised the question of being. And the only truth in that is that no one before me raised the question of being as I raised it with the intent I had, right? My particular way, right? Because plenty of people had different things which they were thinking of as the problem of being before him. And this is a very good book on what those all were, right? So that's useful both to see what's unique about Heidegger's take on all of it, right? And what truth or lack thereof there may be in his charge that philosophy has not paid sufficient attention to the problem of being. But it starts with Aristotle's definition of metaphysics, so it's very close to much what we're doing here. And I would say it's considerably more approachable, if I can put it that way, than what we're reading now, in the sense that it does demand that you know or learn a fair amount about the positions of a large number of philosophers through history. In that sense, it's historically challenging, right? There's lots of characters being invented and there are different doctrines being trotted out. And then Gilson himself has a particular thread he's following through it, which is, in a way, trying to simplify a very complicated history. Those are both challenging aspects of it. But in terms of the actual writing and how hard it is to follow the philosophical points being made in each chapter or paragraph, I would say it's less challenging than the stuff we've been reading, or it's clearer to my reading, at least. Okay, so that's the one we're thinking of for next. And that's your, okay, great. All right. Okay, so let's talk about, we're going to talk about chapters 15 through 20, and I'm going to, there's been a little bit of retrospective on Protagoras here, but fundamentally it's all about Descartes, this whole section, and Descartes and Nietzsche. And the first thing to realize is that there are at least three voices here, right? There's Heidegger, Nietzsche, and Descartes. So Descartes said something, but Heidegger's going to tell you what he thinks is most important about what he said. He's also going to be commenting on Nietzsche's reaction to Descartes, while he is also, Heidegger, reacting to Nietzsche, right? So everybody's commenting on everybody else except that Descartes is not giving you his critique of Nietzsche or Heidegger, right? For historical reasons, so to speak. There'll be various bits of Descartes that are talked about, but almost all of it is from this, Meditations on First Philosophy, or the Meditations it's just called, which is, of Descartes' most famous works. This is probably his second most famous. More people probably read Discourse on the Method than this one, but this one is definitely the philosophically weightier one, more meant for experts, more meant for philosophers. This was written in Latin and dedicated to the doctors of the Sorbonne, as opposed to Discourse on Method, which is written in French and dedicated to the philosophes of Paris or something like that. Not really dedicated, but and there was another one that he wrote, which is even less well known, that he actually wrote earlier in his life, was only published posthumously, called Rules for the Direction of the Mind, which is similar, useful stuff to read, I would say. But Discourse on Method and Meditations on First Philosophy are the two famous things from Descartes, or most famous things from Descartes, and this one is definitely the more systematic. Okay, and all of the famous Cartesian positions of universal doubt, the possibility of a metaphysical deceiver, the I think, an ontological proof for the existence of God, the nature of the external world and extension, proof that the external world exists, all these kinds of things, the truth of clear and distinct ideas, all these characteristic Cartesian positions are all in this little book, which is packs all that into like 80 pages. We talked a little bit last time about how there are ways in which some of the fundamental arguments in Descartes were anticipated by Augustine in the Fathers period, way back in late Rome. It's important to realize that for Descartes himself, how original his position was much less important to him than how clear or true he thought it was, right? He thought that some of the service he was providing here was not that he was being so innovative, but that he was being so clear and that he was stripping things down to their essentials. He was trying to give you the parsimonious and certain and throw away all of the uncertain, wordy, and overly verbose, woolly. He was going to pare philosophy down to its first principle essentials. So he never claimed that each of the things that he kept in doing that was his own new invention. He's not, stumping for his originality. What he is stumping for is the clarity or certainty of the deductions he's making, right? And many of the people he's talking to were well aware of the historical precedents for some of these arguments. His ontological argument is Anselm. His I think argument is Augustine. He's putting together things which were known in the tradition of the doctors he was talking to. That's not true, by the way, of all moderns who read it today. Many moderns who read it today don't know those traditions, in part because Descartes eclipsed them so much. And the simplifications that you find in Descartes were taken as you only have to start here to learn philosophy, and you can throw away all the scholasticism beforehand because everything you need to keep from scholasticism is in this little 80-page book, right? Something like that. So he was used that way, textbook fashion, in the early modern period, and even more so later by people who had for whom scholasticism was a four-letter word, so to speak. All right, so anyway, that's just a little bit of background on Descartes to realize that Descartes has his own voice. You should definitely read this book sometime if you haven't already. Heidegger is going to be talking about him in a way that definitely emphasizes the way in which he is modern, the way in which he is new, right? He's looking at Descartes as, especially for the ways he contrasts with the scholastics before him and the way he anticipates the direction that modern philosophy is going, right? So he's seeing them as a historical link in a chain, and the ways in which Descartes himself has lots of continuity with the stuff before him, and he's not going to emphasize that. He's even going to say at times that this is just the fact that every innovative philosophy has to speak to its contemporaries who understood things the old way, so it has to use their language to explain things to them, and thus winds up getting mired in the old way of thinking, right? But the new way of thinking is the critical thing here for Heidegger. I just want to point out that that is Heidegger's own historical perspective. It's not, there's some elements of that in Descartes. He thinks he's going to establish something from constant sciences, but he's not primarily about historical change himself, in his own self-understanding at least. Okay. The other thing to understand is that Heidegger is going to say that Nietzsche misunderstands Descartes, right? He's going to say that he understands him in a way which is superficial and not entirely fair, and he read about him in secondary sources, and his criticisms were things which have been, wasn't anything new, they've been anticipated before, and so forth. He's still going to say that there are elements of it which have some justice in them. He's also going to claim that Nietzsche is much closer to, or much more dependent upon Descartes historically speaking, for where Nietzsche comes out himself, than Nietzsche himself recognizes. Or otherwise put, Nietzsche is going to accentuate the way in which Descartes is not him, and the way that Nietzsche, is so anti-Descartes, and Heidegger is going to point out the ways in which there's continuity between them, and there's a similarity between them, or the way in which Nietzsche's position is only possible on the basis of Descartes. Okay, so there's all those different things going on in terms of claims not only of who is looking at who and saying what about them, but is it an understanding or a misunderstanding, and in what way? Okay, that makes all of this a complicated section, just because there's so many, there's so many actors looking at each other and saying, questionable, debatable things about each other. The last thing I want to mention is, if you're interested in what Descartes says about, what Nietzsche says about Descartes, there are places where Heidegger is quoting particular things that come from his unpublished manuscripts, etc., as his basis. But there's also a sustained section in the first chapter of Beyond Good and Evil, from aphorism 15 to the end of part 1, which is like aphorism 23. Basically, the second half of chapter 1 of this is kind of a sustained reaction to not just Descartes, but Descartes and things like Descartes in the modern world, giving Nietzsche's own perspective on that, right? So that includes his critique of the certainty with which he thinks Descartes understands the I think and so forth. his own objections to that, what he sees as problematic and questionable in the I think, and so forth. Anyway, and all of that moving towards a what Heidegger rightly calls his instead more body-centered perspective, as opposed to his intellect or representation-centered perspective. And if it helps, the last line of the end of book 1 of Beyond Good and Evil is, "For psychology is now again the path to the fundamental problems," right? The point being that this whole critique of the Cartesian way of looking at things is that he's psychologically naive, so to speak. He's treating the human being as a unitary rational actor who is all mind, right? All judgment and representation, and no emotions, drives, affect, will, self-misunderstanding, unconscious, etc. But if you want to get a kind of reasonably concise, it's like 10 pages, understanding of what what Nietzsche sees as distinctly more truthful or insightful in he himself, Nietzsche, compared to Descartes. That's the place to look, or the place to start. Okay.
You have Heidegger seems to make a point, an interesting and important point about how scrambled up the numbers are in the various notes that he's using in his commentary, Heidegger's commentary. Is this first book, Beyond Good and Evil, that seem to have a numbered series too? Are those coherent, and did Nietzsche create them?
Completely coherent. Beyond Good and Evil was published in his lifetime, right after Zarathustra, as his own book with his own plan, completely coherent. He doesn't actually say Descartes, all over this section I'm citing to you. He instead talks about the I think, right? There are still harmless self-observers who believe that there are immediate certainties. For example, I think, or as the superstition of Schopenhauer put it, I will. As though knowledge here got hold of its object purely and nakedly as the thing in itself, without any falsification on the part of either the subject or the object, right? That's the kind of topic that he's talking about. He's not saying the words Descartes or Descartes' position. He's talking about the I think as immediate certainty idea, more generally. And then he's critiquing all that from his own point of view. Anyway, the point is, if you want to get a version of what Nietzsche thinks about Descartes and Cartesian-like thinking that isn't filtered through what Heidegger says about it, but you're getting sort of straight from Nietzsche, I would recommend aphorisms 15 through 23 of chapter 1 of Beyond Good and Evil. Okay. All right, that was all different sources you could look at. You can get all the other people's takes on this debate as well as Heidegger's own if you want. Now we got to get to first impressions on our actual 6 chapters. Joe's on mute.
I first came to the clear observation that the conclusion of the actually somebody else's separate, it was Nietzsche's separate essay on Protagoras. That was the final thing we read. I got the feeling that, okay, that's the launching point. We're in the middle of something. I want to keep on going, but I'm going to stop and talk today first. And then, so that's one impression I had. But also, I like the way it seems to come together. I think that will to power, it's undoubtedly something that's really different from what other people might have called the life force. But that seems to be almost a thing there. And then, so the will to power is the survival instinct. And I like the way in which he shows power sort of needs more power. It needs to be both enhanced and, what are the two categories? There's enhancement, that's one of its values.
And preservation,
power.
Yes.
And preservation, right, okay. Yes. So I saw how all those came in. And now I'm sort of feeling, okay, let's keep this going so I can bring it together. I'm so pleased we have this recording for today.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. I mean, I'll say that the stuff that Heidegger himself is trying to bring together here is kind of trying to show ways in which Nietzsche has a structural similarity to Descartes and a dependence upon him. that's going to culminate in Heidegger's own diagnosis of Nietzsche's metaphysical position. And that's not the same as Nietzsche's own self-understanding of his metaphysical position vis-a-vis Descartes. To Nietzsche, it is a fundamental advance over Descartes on his own part, that he is substituting this nuanced physiology, psychology, and the body for to Nietzsche, the naive idea that man is a thinking thing, a thing that thinks, which he finds in Descartes. And to Nietzsche, that's like a fundamental thing where he in the 19th century and the psychologists who come after him, the people like Freud and Jung influenced by him, etc., are fundamentally deeper, more insightful, because more mistrustful thinkers, more mistrustful of the rationality of man, something like that. And Nietzsche makes much of that difference. Heidegger, on the other hand, is pointing out that there's an enormous continuity there, that they're both seeing man, the subject, as the center of the whole thing, right? And Nietzsche thinks that it's fundamental that he's understanding that subject in a more physiological, body-centered, psychologically sophisticated way. But that's still thinking of man, the subject, as the center of the relationship in which truth happens. It's still consummate subjectivity from Heidegger's point of view. And in that way, it's the fulfillment of a direction that Descartes launched modern philosophy upon. So for Heidegger, that continuity is in a way more important than that difference. They're both there. He acknowledges that the difference is there, but the continuity is more essential to him, if I can put it that way. In addition, besides the continuation in the direction of subjectivity, there's also a way in which both of them are also filling out what Heidegger sees as the structure of or pattern of metaphysics itself, which is a bigger thing he's trying to claim. Okay. First reactions from Steve, who is a little bit low.
I understood more of this than I have in the past, and I pretty much got the point that you just made. I didn't get the subtlety of what Heidegger was saying about Nietzsche and Descartes, but it did sound similar to me from what they were saying. I got confused in a couple of spots with some of his arguments, like
That's
right
great.
up in the
Definitely
beginning.
get to them.
Yeah. Okay.
Tell me exactly where. That's what we're here for.
Well, two parts. where he has this way of repeating the same word in his argument, like he does. The being of the being is being until they're becoming. This time he did it with representing to me.
Yes.
And I think I finally got to it. I mean, what he's saying is that man senses something, and then he represents that or put the picture of it in his head. Is that what he was saying?
Representation is not simply the picture in your head, which for Descartes, the term for that is imagination. The picture you have in your head of something is imagination to Descartes. For Descartes, representation is something like your logical, mathematical, structured thoughts about something. Your understanding of it as pure concepts, not just as an image, something imagined. Yeah. He's distinguishing it sharply from something you imagine outside your mind, like an object. Right. There's the thing the senses present to you, and there's your imagination, which is kind of dependent upon your senses, using imagined sight, etc. Those are both to Descartes just feeding information to or raw material to the rational mind. And the rational mind is the kind of thing you do math with, you do geometry with, you do logic with, and that makes actual judgments about things. And your actual judgments about things are what he's calling representation. So his feeling of the temperature from the fire is sense. His imagining a centaur is imagination, but his conclusion that he exists is representation. Right? It's a judgment and conclusion he arrived at by reasoning. And
interpretation, would that be a good word?
it's not just interpretation. Interpretation has a different meaning for both Nietzsche and Heidegger, and in Descartes, he's trying to get something like the content of the idea, right, which is something like just the logical concept itself. His favorite examples are mathematical, right? You know, the triangle and the facts about the triangle, which is not the physical triangle. It's not the imagined triangle. It's the thing that appears in math theorems triangle, right? And the thing
that last is representation.
That last is the idea of the triangle. Representation is the idea that not just the idea, it's the judgments you come to about those concepts. So when you prove a theorem to yourself that the sum of the angles of every triangle is equal to 2 right angles, right? You are judging a truth about concepts. The concepts themselves are not quite yet representation. The judgments of truth about concepts is representation. So
there has to be there's a universal truth.
Yes.
Or can my representation be different than yours?
Only when one of them is wrong for Descartes.
Okay, I got it then.
Yeah, Descartes actually says that my clear and distinct ideas are necessarily true. And the only way that his ideas can be false is if they are unclear or indistinct or confused. His judgments about his ideas can also be false if he has judged them where he did not have certainty. If he guessed, and sometimes he might guess and be right, and sometimes he might guess and be wrong, but if he's judging something outside the sphere where he is certain, he is misusing his will, according to Descartes. The natural light wants you to wait until you have certainty before you judge, says Descartes. But Descartes is all about trying to find the ground of certainty, and he's finding the ground of certainty in something like the abstract mathematical version of thinking about things. So to put this in modern science terms, right? He wants the mathematical theory of the reality behind the world. That's your representation of the world, right? The billiard balls you're playing with on the pool table are understood by sense perception, but the abstractions about them that you have in your physics seminar and the math you do on them is the representation of the actions of the billiard balls on the table, including the laws you think they're following as part of those representations. And the whole point is to replace your confused sense perception and vain imaginings about things with the coherent mathematical, logical, thought-like structure of the concepts version of them, which to Descartes is the truth about them. It's the permanent being-like truth about them. It's how God thinks about them.
I was thinking about people that do the programming to create virtual reality.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the programming is very mathematical and it's very specific, and it's built, it's written down.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just in somebody's mind. Surely that can't possibly be representation.
Yes, it is.
And that would be the truth. So it is. Okay. I suspected that.
The mathematical program of the virtual world is to that world, right, as the representation is to the experiential for Descartes, right? This is, by the way, why he says of extended things, it's the thought about them in their extension, which is the representation version of them. Why? Because it's a famous example of the piece of wax. He takes a piece of wax and he says, it's this body, it has all these characteristics, but then he puts the wax near the fire and heats it up, and its odor changes and its color changes, and it becomes more fluid, and it loses whatever sound it had when it would hit it, and you can't even touch it anymore because it's too hot, and it loses all of its characteristics except being an extended thing in space with a certain quantity of matter. Well, that means that the thing which it kept, the extended thing in space that has a certain quantity of matter, is the essence of that thing. So the representation version of the piece of wax is the mass that it contains extended in space in some certain configuration or another. So the extended being of the extended body substance is the representational reality of the external world in a kind of mathematical physics way. So that's the way he wants to treat the whole realm of extension, the whole realm of body, is at that level of sort of concrete physical abstraction, if I can put it that way. It's abstract, but it's meant to be, the truths about the external things, which are invariant through their, mere appearance to me, their changes through time, their changes of state, etc. For Descartes, that's only part of what he means by representation, though. The other part is the stuff about knowledge about himself, knowledge about logic, knowledge about his mind, knowledge about God, which is the sort of truths of psychology or metaphysics or first philosophy that he also thinks can be as mathematically known as either mathematics on the one hand or this kind of external mathematical physics on the other. In the structure of the meditations, there is a definite ordering of these things in terms of what depends upon the other as the prior known certainty. Knowing yourself is the most certain thing. Knowing God is the second most certain thing. And knowing external reality is the third most certain thing. And each of them depends upon knowledge of the previous. So compared to the medieval scheme, that's putting self and your knowledge of yourself as a thinking thing as the core of what is rationally knowable, above even knowledge of God, which the medievals might have put first, right? And that's the sense in which man is moving to the center as the subject. The most certain knowledge you have is that you are, and that you are a thinking thing, that you are a something that thinks. That's the ego cogito, right? Or the cogito me cogitare. I think that I am a thinking thing. And the point of that is, you might also be something else beside a thinking thing, but you are way more certain that you are a thinking thing than you are that you have any other characteristics like a body or a finite lifespan or anything like that, all of which you would have to go through all kinds of other hoops to become certain of. You're way more certain that you're a thinking thing than you are of those other facts, if they're facts. And that means that since your knowledge of it doesn't depend upon those other facts, Descartes is going to claim, neither does the being of your being a thinking thing depend on those other facts. That you are and are a thinking thing is more certain, and it is as independent of those other facts as the extended nature of the wax is from its color, right? So this is his attempt to found something like, a rational psychology or a knowledge of the soul as, as the thinking thing. Okay, so when he's talking about representation,
So
go ahead.
If I understood that correctly, the way you rank those, yourself, God, and then external reality, I mean, wouldn't Descartes say that God is unknowable, so therefore external reality is even more unknowable? No, okay.
Yeah, this is what very, very, very good. Yes, no, you're entirely right. But he starts by knowing himself, even if God were intentionally a deceiver and trying to fool him about everything.
Right.
He claims that if God were trying to fool him about everything, that and he didn't actually have a body who was just being fed illusory sense impulses, he still would be a thinking thing that was being fed these illusory impulses. Even an all-powerful deceiver could not deceive him about the fact that he existed or was a thinking thing.
Right.
After he establishes that, then he notices that among the ideas that he has the idea of an infinite self-caused perfect being within his consciousness, and he asks, where can this idea have come from? Could have come from me, could have come from something less perfect than me, could have come from something less real than me, and so on. And after rejecting a bunch of those possibilities, he arrives instead at the idea that there has to be something that is the support of his own existence, which has necessary existence. And it's whatever other things are necessary to cause me, however epiphenomenal I am, there is some underlying real thing of which I am even an epiphenomena, right? So there is some root being at first cause position in the chain of whatever dependence of reality there is, and that is God.
I see. Okay.
So, if you ask him what the content of God is, he'll say it's either nature or the order that God put in nature, and he'll leave that agnostic as something he doesn't know which, right? But at other times, it will be the full idea of the best being out of St. Anselm and the ontological proof, right? But he starts from proving himself. Then he asks, where does this thinking self that he has get its idea of God? And it claims that God, an actual God of some kind, is the origin of his idea of God. An actual underlying being is the origin of his idea of truth. And it is only on the basis of his belief that that is true and that such a God cannot be a deceiver that he arrives at belief in the external world, right? He only comes to trust his instinct after he trusts God.
Got it.
So first he trusts his own existence before he even trusts God or that there is any God. He arrives at the idea of God from his own notion of it and asking where it came from in a kind of first cause argument. And then after he's established both those things, he only arrives at the faith in the existence of the external world by his belief that his clear and distinct ideas are true and that the being or God that supports his own existence cannot be in all respects a deceiver. So that's the basis of his trust in his senses. And he revisits his previous distrust of his senses back when he started his old doubt to ask, where do his errors actually come from? And why are the senses sometimes deceiving of him? And he comes up with different reasons why that happens in the places where he misjudges his reason without certainty, or his senses are adapted to his usual state as opposed to the disease state or special state that he's in. But it's not that his senses are always in themselves deceptive. And it's on the basis of rehabilitating his trust in senses as a side effect of his trust in God as not deceptive that he arrives at a faith in the external world. Joe.
Okay. I haven't read Descartes, so all I know is the very shallow stuff. Does he think that if you start with himself, of course, then you go to the God, because that's and he gets to reality as a third step.
Yes.
Now, if for somehow God didn't justify the existence of this reality part, then he would be sort of stuck in a solipsistic circle, wouldn't he?
Correct. He even would go so far as to say that from the standpoint of his certainty, he is so certain that he exists that he would exist even if God were a deceiver. And after he decides that a God who is not deceptive exists, he is still more certain of those facts than he is that the external worlds exist at all. That the external worlds exist at all
is not a deceiver. The external world does exist, right?
Well, it's a further deduction, is my point, and therefore one of less certainty that the external worlds exist. So it's almost like he leaves open this possibility that there could be a time or a circumstance in which he as a thinking thing could exist and God might exist as well without the external world existing. That would not be a contradiction in terms. It takes extra evidence from other arguments and facts to convince him that in addition, an external world, the world of extension, exists, right? The world of extended things. But the point of all this is that it's the very opposite direction of empiricism, right? You're not starting from the evidence of the senses and arriving at the belief in a mind, and then from that arriving at a belief in a God or something like that. starting from a belief in himself and his own mind, then a belief in a God or being or basis of reality or abstract idea of truth, and then from that arriving at an external world or faith in this, a mitigated or qualified faith in the senses. And he says, by the way, that all of this was the result of this acid test of doubt, where before he went through the acid test of doubt, he believed whatever the senses told him, and he thought that all of his ideas came from the senses. In other words, this is not a position that is ignorant of Locke. It starts from Locke and then doubts everything the senses tell him. It starts from the idea that all thoughts I have came from my senses, and then proceeds to ask, are there any things which I cannot doubt? And everything coming from his senses he can doubt, but his existence he cannot. Right. So that's the basic structure of the meditations. Along the way, he'll explain how error is possible for him if his clear and distinct ideas are true, and God is not as a deceiver. How is it that Descartes ever errs? Right? And his answer, seriously, this is an open question. This is the subject matter of meditation 4 on truth and falseness, right? He needs to know where falseness or error can come from. And the claim is that although his reason is perfect after its kind, it's extremely limited. There are only a few things he understands clearly and distinctly. And his will is perfect after its kind. It can judge of anything. But it is more infinite than his understanding. An error, according to Descartes, arises when your will goes farther than your understanding, when you judge of things of which you are not certain, when your finite reason doesn't know, but your infinite will judges anyway. So the possibility of error arises for man, the finite mind, because he has an infinite free will and a very limited understanding. So that's the doctrine of the origin and possibility of error in the meditations.
Well, sounds like Nietzsche would really have hated that, because Nietzsche.
So Nietzsche is in a way keeping this scheme and then asking, so what if you're in error? Descartes thinks that it is that the natural light tells him that it is better to judge without, if you have no certainty, it's better to suspend judgment than to guess with the possibility of being wrong, even if you were sometimes right. Because Descartes directly says, if you judge and are right only by chance, you have still misused your reason, right?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
This is exactly the proposition that Nietzsche denies. Nietzsche thinks the best thing about man is his infinite will, and of course he judges. He has to judge. He has to come to conclusions, and to suspend your judgment about whether or not a tiger is chasing you when a tiger is chasing you is not an adaptive choice, right? You cannot wait for certainty that the thing chasing you is a tiger that wants to eat you. You have to get out of dodge on the heroic assumption that it's better to get out of dodge than to wait and attain certainty. So
actually, that sort of explains racial prejudice. When you see a stranger and you fear him based on all kinds of prejudices, this is uncertainty, and your will is good.
I will partially agree in the sense that Nietzsche's pragmatic approach to these judgments, that it's better to judge pragmatically speaking, even if you don't have certainty about it, or even if the judgments are sometimes false or unjust, can be used to justify any degree of interested ideological which we will come to later. But I'm just making a point that Nietzsche in a way dislikes the retiring, waiting for certainty aspect of Descartes. In another sense, he thinks that Descartes is naive and expecting that he can be certain of the things which he Descartes thinks are pure logic or immediate evidence of his senses, right? So Nietzsche will want to psychoanalyze all of Descartes' judgments and find that actually he was interested in certainty here and interested in power there, and it was some other drive besides his trust that was involved over here and so forth. That's what you find in the Beyond Good and Evil sections that I was pointing you at. Yeah, that the other reason less stated reason that Nietzsche doesn't like this whole chain of reasoning is it's got two things as consequences and side effects that were essential to Descartes that Nietzsche himself rejects. It's trying to prove that man is a rational soul, independent of his body, and it's proving something like the existence of an objective God, both of which are propositions that Nietzsche rejects, right? So he doesn't like the conclusions, therefore he has to find fault with the reasoning, right? Now he also he has reasons for distrusting those conclusions, right? He thinks that those are motivated conclusions and of exactly the kind of, they were finding a true world behind the world that was more perfect than the world for all the usual Platonic reasons that we've learned that Nietzsche distrusts in previous philosophy, right? But from Descartes' point of view, those are things that by proving along the way, he can be sure of a good reception from the learned doctors of the Sorbonne, right? And his dedication letter to the Meditations is all saying, I'm sure you'll find nothing here to disapprove of, and all the things I'm proving here are perfectly compatible with doctrine and so forth. He's especially careful that he realizes he's putting certainty of his own existence above certainties of faith, and he is very careful in the dedicatory letter to find the papal bull that calls heretics anyone who doesn't agree with that ordering of them. Because you might think that C.S. Lewis fashion that the church doctrine was that faith comes first, and any human certainty of anything after that, like the existence of God, only follows from it. But that wasn't the actual church position, because it wasn't Aquinas's position. It wasn't the scholastic position. The scholastic position was that the existence of God can be proved by reason alone, and faith is something additional and supplementary to that. So Descartes is fully in keeping with accepted doctrine on the point when he puts.
So did C.S. Lewis just get it backwards, or is he preaching from a different gospel?
Different gospel. He's different, not even gospel, but a different position within religion, but also a different position in history and the ideological history of religion in the modern world, something like that.
Okay.
But yes, they have a very different view of the strength, power, and typical results of human reason. In a way, Lewis is expecting reason to come out in a Nietzschean nihilistic position, whereas at the time of Descartes, people are expecting reason to come out in a of course, proofs of God are rational proofs of the existence of God are possible, right? That's something that Hume doesn't think is possible, and something that the Epicureans don't think is possible, and something that Kant thinks he's proved is impossible, right? By the time of the Critique of Pure Reason, in the time of Descartes, that's not what the philosophers think, or what most of the philosophers think, at least. Okay, so anyway, that's all of this is triggered by representation, right? And I gave you the version of what representation is that is what Descartes thinks of it. Now, there's also an understanding of representation that we're getting here from Heidegger, and he's perfectly well aware of all this stuff about the distinction between representation and like content of sense perception. But Heidegger is also trying to explain that the kind of the key thing in Descartes is this full doctrine of representation, he calls it, a full structure of representation, which is to Heidegger an entire notion of truth, right? Representation is the thing represented and the mind representing it in a relation in which the being that is posited by the mind, is the certain and true thing, and that's what makes it being, and it appears to the mind because being able to appear to the mind is what representations do. So there's an entire doctrine of what counts as true and what counts as being in this notion of representation. The way that sort of typical academic philosophers will put this is, to Descartes, to be is to be thinkable, to have thinkable real attributes, right? It's not to be perceivable, it's not to be imaginable, it is to be thinkable in a suitably conceptual math-like sense. So yeah, so and Heidegger is pointing out that there's a full-blown theory of truth involved in this notion of representation of to be is to be the thinkable, conceptual, rational, thought-like thing, not its appearances, not the perspectival ways in which it, seemed to sway this or that creature. That's not what makes something real to Descartes. The real thing about the wax is not how it appears to my senses. The real thing about the wax is the unchanging essential essence, which remains of the wax through all of its possible transformations, which is that it is an extended thing with a quantity attached, right? And shapes possible. Anyway, that's the getting back to this. What is meant by representation here? Okay. The other thing to hear in representation is it's this your certainty of yourself as a thinking thing comes first. And Heidegger's version of that is man, the subject, is the thing before which possible truths appear and are judged as to whether or not they are real. Right? In that sense, this is exactly man moving to the center of doctrines of truth, being, philosophy, metaphysics, right? And this is, the whole first chapter of ours is, subject of the modern age, of how subject comes to mean man, when before, biology was a subject and chemistry was a subject. Now subject means the human mind pole of any subject-object relation. Why, right? The answer is because man is the place where representation happens. Conscious thought has become the actual judging subject of all truth. Okay. There's something else going on in 16, which if you don't know enough later philosophy is easy to miss, which is there's ways in which the parts of Descartes that Heidegger is bringing out and underlying are not the ones that might be chosen by Descartes himself, but the ones that are most influential for later philosophy, especially later German idealist philosophy. This is the idea that Descartes basically invents the modern concept of the self. The self that you get in Fichte or in Hegel or in Kierkegaard is already there in a way in Descartes as this the I know that I am a thinking thing. That is the self-seeing itself of self-consciousness. The place where self-consciousness first arises as this critical fulcrum of modern philosophy is the I cogito in Descartes, is the claim. And I think it's a supportable claim. This is, the people like Kant and Fichte are definitely directly thinking back to Descartes here. And the fact that there was a version of that I cogito deduction, so to speak, in Augustine was not enough to set them on this path of the idea of the self. What's critical about the self? The idea of the self is that there's something like not just consciousness, but self-consciousness. The consciousness in which mental-like concepts appear to itself, a self-reflecting, a self-mirroring kind of thing, as a purely abstract locus of thought, right? That's the idea of self-consciousness. And in Hegel, the world becoming self-conscious is the actual, history of the universe, right? The history of the universe is the world becoming self-conscious as absolute spirit, right? But the man in the center as self-consciousness is something you find characteristically in the other later German idealisms of people like Fichte and Hegel in his own way, Kierkegaard. Go ahead, Joe.
I think we see a version of that, or maybe clarify, a version of that even in someone like Adam Smith, who's talking about the the outside person that views you, and you actually see through that outside observer's eyes, and that's how you judge yourself as behaving properly or not. And
That's a
so
slightly,
as that,
that's a different thing. That's more like the notion that you get in both Smith and, for that matter, in Rousseau, make much of this, the persona or your social person or the way you're viewed socially as a separate role that you take on. That's a kind of social understanding that's not the same thing as this interior of the self view that you find in the philosophers. The actual predecessor that you find for this is, you find something similar in a lot of the medieval mystics. You find it in people like Meister Eckhart. You find it in, yeah, I mean, plenty of the medieval mystics had the same focus on the self, and you find that echoed, by the way, in Kierkegaard. But the self is not simply how others view you. It's not the Heideggerian they self kind of thing. It's consciousness appearing to itself as self-consciousness, something like that. Aristotelian thought thinking itself could be thought of as something outside of your head, but thought thinking itself as the description of what is happening inside your head, and of a description of what you yourself are, right, is more like the notion of self. And in a way, this is a predecessor of Heidegger's own Dasein. Dasein has a much more plugged into the world structure to it, and it's the self notion is instead a much more stripped down thing, which is fundamentally related only to itself and to its own thought, and to something like the idea of appearing, and it not necessarily even being that's appearing, as opposed to being self appearing to itself. But this self-reflective consciousness notion is definitely critical to later German philosophy. And my point is just that in the chapter 16 part, where he's talking about the cogito me cogitare, right? I think that I am a thinking thing, right? That structure, as part of the structure of representation in Descartes, Heidegger is stressing because it's so important later, right? It's so important for the future career of subjectivism in modern German idealism, especially. Okay. Still haven't gotten first reactions from Pete.
Yeah, so I quite liked it when I got to the end, and I thought, well, this is a neat summary of the subject and the postmodern, the reason it becomes an issue for postmodernism and it rejects it. Because in the 60s, the post-structuralists, the literary critics, people like Barth, they all react against the subject and the sense of the self. And here Heidegger is giving a good summary of, well, what does the subject mean? Well, we have in Greek times Protagoras, and then that, when Protagoras refers to the self, the man, then that becomes the subjectum in Latin, and then after the scholastic period, Descartes and the Enlightenment reinterprets the subject, and then that sets off, the scientific modern understanding, or the German idealist understanding of the subject. And then we get Nietzsche's understanding of the subject, and Now we're going to reject all of those because of Heidegger's new ontological understanding of being that now puts the subject as just one particular historical, one understanding of man in three different ways, the Greek, the Enlightenment, and Nietzsche's modern understanding. And I thought, well, this is actually a really nice summary of what sort of becomes in the 60s the rejection of the subject and the self by the post-structuralists, etc. It's neat, obvious, and important.
I'm going to partly agree with you, but partly some of them are just Nietzschean in the sense that they're just rejecting the earlier rational unitary self in favor of a disaggregated self that is plugged into other structural forces in the world, etc. And they want to they're primary the same kind of criticisms that Nietzsche has of Descartes, they have of the subject tradition generally, but the result is that they are going to disaggregate the self rather than eliminate it, right? And in a way, that was what Nietzsche was already doing. So some of those people are not going beyond Nietzsche; they're just getting as far as Nietzsche on that path. I'll mention that the other place this comes up is not just for the notions of self, but the notion of what we would call something like grand meta-narratives or something like that. The Weltanschauungs or ideologies, which are the sort of modern correlate of will to power. They're the totalizing ideologies of from particular perspectives as particular notions of justice for particular ends. That all turns into the idea of any grand meta narrative, right? And you find in the postmodernists an attempt to reject the grand meta narratives as such, which itself winds up becoming something of a grand meta narrative. But that's a complexity you can get to later. But yeah, I mean, this is definitely influential on some of those later thought. I think you gotta some of them don't know all of the different positions well enough to know how far they themselves are along the chain, for example. There's another version of this. I'm thinking of I think it's Bloomberg, The Age of the World Picture. It's a kind of a rereading of this modern history that's trying to be a little bit more rehabilitating the Enlightenment or the Cartesian project, not based upon its own self-understanding, but based upon its replacement of what came before it, something like that. A half-hearted, pragmatic embracing of the Enlightenment meta-narrative just to get out of medievalism, something like that. But instrumentally thought of. But you know, the point is that there's lots of later thinkers who are going to use this chessboard and ring changes on it, if I can put it that way. Sometimes without full acknowledgement of how dependent they are upon the previous stuff. Okay, there's definitely, sorry, Brian, do you want to have any first reactions to this?
Well, again, I've been late to it, and you know, I have to say again, my biggest thing is just gratitude that there's some forum where this is accessible to me, where this is being discussed. I really appreciate because I've been interested in these things since I was in high school.
Yep.
And I've never had a chance to really focus. I read about it over the years off and on. My reaction is a lot of my reactions I feel like have been kind of, you know, beside the point, but let me, you know, on the previous readings, but let me just say why did it's a question, I guess, and I think I know the answer, but why is Heidegger choosing this particular topic and this particular interpretation of Descartes, Nietzsche, and the others? I think he's trying to make a point. It's not just he's not just trying
Yes.
to be an exposition.
Yes, he's definitely trying to make a point, and the I would say the main thing he's trying to do here is I'm going to use some later language. He's trying to put Nietzsche in a larger discursive formation into which he fits as one term in a series, as opposed to as a way of overcoming all of previous history of Western thought, right? He says at one point, everything depends upon viewing Nietzsche's objections to Descartes metaphysically, or as an example of metaphysics. And what he means by that is that Heidegger, is trying to get something like a critical distance on Nietzsche himself, to not be simply stuck in Nietzscheanism, if I can put it that way. And the way he's doing that is by understanding Nietzsche historically as part of a progression which is not simply unfolding with the way that Nietzsche explained it, right? Nietzsche has a whole explanation of Western history as the development of nihilism and understanding of previous philosophies and this fundamentally moral lens that was the unconscious will to power of this or that previous philosopher. And Heidegger is disagreeing with that view of history of Nietzsche by saying, actually, you, Nietzsche, fit into this unfolding historical structure of recurrent metaphysical positions in which you slot in right after Descartes as someone dependent upon Descartes. And you may think that you're completely overturning Descartes, but you're only disagreeing with him in one little nuance, right? And you're still fulfilling this whole structure of metaphysics. You still have exactly this doctrine of the nature of the subject that's dependent upon your understanding of the nature of truth and of the nature of being. And your understanding of the nature of truth and being is just thoroughgoing modern subjectivism, which you got from Descartes, by the way, and you've just taken it in the body unconscious drives direction to emphasize the commonality of, or the continuity between man and the animal as opposed to man and the rational. You're just emphasizing the animal side of animal rationale in the history of metaphysics. And you may think you're doing that as a great corrective to Descartes, but you're really just two sides of the same coin of man, the subject, as the rational, animal as the center of truth and history. And all the different possibilities of this metaphysical structure have now been thoroughly exhausted, and the changes all played out by the time we've gotten to Nietzsche. We can see all of those positions. We can see all of them historically happening, and none of it fits Nietzsche's own understanding of that history as one in which he, Nietzsche, ushers in the truth that supersedes all the previous. Right?
Does this tie in with his, I've noticed that he shifts in words from metaphysics to ontology. And what he feels like he's doing, what Heidegger feels like he's doing is ontology, what the others did was metaphysics. Is there anything to that?
Partly right. Yes, the metaphysics word is being used for the notion of the being of beings, or the being that all beings have in common, beings as such and as a whole. Whereas ontology is a broader term for anything about the question of being that he is usually using. Well, he's using at this stage to also talk about the truth of being, and he's contrasting the truth of being with metaphysics. The truth of being is something like the history of metaphysics, and something bigger than the history of metaphysics that understands that metaphysics has a history for reasons, which aren't just metaphysical reasons. There's something like historical reasons and structural reasons about the nature of man's relationship to being. But that's where Heidegger's own philosophy is coming out. But he's all of that is a kind of attempt to be a broader perspective on how thought is directing human life than you find in Nietzsche alone, or than you found in Descartes alone. And especially one which sees it as more historical. Um, that's not quite fair to Nietzsche. Nietzsche also sees it as historical, but the, the the structure of the history is different for Heidegger than it is for Nietzsche, and it's way more historical for both of them than it was for Descartes, for example. Yeah. Okay, so and why does he care so much about this particular subject of Descartes and Nietzsche? For him, Descartes and all philosophy dependent from Descartes is coextensive with the modern world as modern, right? The modern world, the world since the Enlightenment, the world of European history after medievalism, right? After rule by the church, where it's just determined by secular philosophy, humanism, and Enlightenment. That whole modern world for Heidegger begins with Descartes and depends essentially on metaphysics that's either Cartesian or descendant from Cartesian metaphysics. No Descartes in that sense, no modern world, right? And for him, Nietzsche is the culmination of that tendency. He is the currently reigning philosophy that is determining the events we're actually seeing all around us. Everybody around him is a power political Nietzschean, right? The ideological 20th century, with the age of the struggle for dominion over the earth, is power political Nietzscheanism, right? There's some asides in some of our chapters here where he talks about, the events going on during World War II and reactions to modern technology, and a bunch of these little asides, some of which are embarrassing. But the net effect of all of them is to say something like, of course, everyone today is only interested in the cultivation of power from their perspective and treats everything like an appeal to universal values as merely propaganda for the sake of winning something, right? And it's just a matter of course that that's how everyone acts and how everyone expects everyone else to act. Why? Because they're all Nietzscheans, right? We're living in a Nietzschean world not because Nietzsche is eternally right about the nature of the world, but because that's the historical epoch through which we are passing. And every historical epoch is informed by the metaphysics of its day. So in that sense, trying to get some distance on the metaphysics of your day is like the essential task of being awake to the historical processes you're living through for Heidegger. Can you come out somewhere less Nietzschean? Open question. He's sort of thrown it out there as promise, and he hasn't actually fulfilled the promissory note. He's just saying it could be possible if we decided to think differently or something like that. But he has not fleshed that out, right? It's fair to say here he has not fleshed that out.
So what he has is a new understanding of being that all the other philosophers didn't see until Heidegger came along. And that's his special use of ontology as the conditions for the possibility for there to be all these different metaphysics in different epochs and to different cultures. And he's interested in that, and that's what he calls the truth of being. And he also calls the clearing what are the conditions that would explain all the types of metaphysics since Protagoras, for Descartes, for Nietzsche, and also because he now thinks we're moving into a new epoch, or in 1940 they are moving into the new epoch, which is now beyond Nietzsche's understanding of value, of metaphysics as a value system and will to power that everybody else is following along in, because they're still thinking 19th century metaphysics and they don't understand what's happening now in 1940. but he's hinting at that. But he's in these 6 chapters really focusing in on the subject. But his thing is that Heidegger's not another meta-narrative. It's about the question of being and ontology ultimately. And he's asking it in a way that none of these other philosophers have.
Well, partly true, but partly he's diagnosing them as all different in what their doctrine of the meaning of being was, right? So for him, ontology is noticing that the meaning of being is subject to interpretation by man and has a history. And the truth of being is about the revealing of this, right? It's the fact that how being is interpreted by man to man, how being appears to man changes, has a history. So the ontology is at first just the word for the realm at which there is something like a meaning of being, which instead of being a single unitary thing that is true through all time, is instead a variable, right? Ontology is the notion that the meaning of being is a variable. And that's how some of these different philosophical epochs differ from one another, is the variable meaning of being has assumed different values in different ages. And he wants to understand that historical process. To understand that historical process, you first have to come at it realizing that something like the meaning of being can be something that can change, that can have a history.
Right, and that's what he refers to as the being of beings. And he has other words for it, and it's presencing, and the metaphysics of how we understand what's present in front of us. And then the truth of being, he's reserves for the ontological structures that make it possible for things to presence in different ways.
Partly right, but partly he also it is also meant to be a focus on the appearing of those structural facts about being, so to speak, to man, right? The truth of operator is including the appearing to relation, if I can put it that way. I just want to point out that when we get into our next section, he's going to have a retrospective there where he goes back and talks about, the 13 years since being in time, and it might be that he means the 13 years between 40 and 53, but I think he means between 27 and 40. And he kind of says this different thought about man as the subject was in a way the motivation for being in time. And he's also going to say, I didn't really manage to finish all that, right? He's going to say that there's something here which is supposed to be moving in the direction of the truth of being, but I can't claim to have actually consummated it yet, right? He's limiting the claim he's making on this regard. It's a project and an ongoing thing he's trying to do, but he doesn't yet think he has succeeded in doing at the time when he's writing this. Above all, the path taken terminates abruptly at a decisive point, and he'll explain that when we get there. But the point that I'm trying to make is it is not the case that Heidegger already has a fully worked out alternate schema into which all the rest of this fits as a little secondary pocket, and he has an entire map of the resulting continent, right?
Absolutely.
Sorry?
Yeah. He does not have the whole schema. He's not
That's
coming
right.
with his theory of history and science and everything.
Yes, he's trying to discover those things. He's trying to discover those things.
It's ontological.
Sure. But the point I'm making is that he is in the process of feeling his way towards trying to discover that continent out of the relationships that he sees in the problematic history of metaphysics, something like that, right? He's not so distant from and independent of the history he is studying that he would be able to see all these things from his other perspective without looking back at this history. All the raw material for seeing that these things can change is coming from actually studying the empirical history where they did change, right?
We only have the history we're thrown into.
Something like that. Okay, excellent questions. Okay, do we want to at least briefly try to go through these chapters and talk about what's in each of them and answer people's questions about them? I know I would.
Let's do it.
The subject in the modern
I would
age.
think,
Go ahead.
what would be the alternative? Just to ignore them, or to summarize and
the alternative
skip on?
the alternative would be to let people choose the threads that they want to talk about that might go through all 6 of them instead of trying to take them in succession one at a time.
Sequential versus thread-like.
Yes.
I like sequential because I don't have a good coherent thread in my mind.
That's good. We'll go with the thread called the number line then. Right. So the first chapter 15 is really about changing the notion of subject and how subject comes to mean
Wait
man.
a minute. Isn't 50 the first chapter next week?
No, the first chapter now.
Oh, screw.
15.
Well, at least we're recording. Thank you.
You prepared 10 through 14. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I did. I'm sorry. It was. I'm not claiming that. Did anybody else? Did other people misunderstand as I did, or does anybody else care?
I don't think so. 10 to 14 was the
And if
stuff.
no-
Go ahead.
Well, I'm not going to hold up the group because I can watch the recordings again. Thank you very much. And that just means I do more reading in the next 2 weeks.
Sure. I still think it might be useful to stay in here, but either way. So
well, then follow threads. Stay useful. Do something back from last week. No, but I did feel the whole thing was incomplete, and that's why possibly I didn't. I mean, thank you very much for tolerating me.
The subject in the modern age. So subject moves from being subject matter in general, what lies under what you're talking about, to meaning something like the subject in the modern sense of subject and object. It means the pole of consciousness as opposed to the thing that is understanding, right, as the object over against it. That change happens particularly in the modern age, and Heidegger's asking, what's bringing that change about? How did we go to subject meaning, whatever the textbook is discussing, to it meaning the person looking at it, right? And the claim is going to be that happens in and through Descartes, who is the one who puts man at the center that way. And the first diagnosis is what is the being is transformed into the question about the fundamentum absolutum inconcussum veritas, right? Which I love the Latin of, right? The absolute unshakable ground of the truth, but it's the ground absolute inconcussum, unshakable, right, of truth. What is the unshakable ground of truth? And the unshakable ground of truth in Descartes is the truths about the subject, the truth that I know that I exist and I know that I am a thinking thing, right? That's where certainty, hits rock bottom, so to speak. Descartes mentions one point, Archimedes says, give me one fixed point to move and I will move the world in its orbit, right? The one Archimedean point that is fixed for him is the certainty of our knowledge that we are and that we are thinking things. And then he points out that this is, in a way, man standing on his own in a new way that he wasn't before, and that's a kind of liberation. It is a liberation as a self-empowerment of man, and it should be pointed out that in a way he's going beyond Descartes here. He's pointing to an historical effect of Descartes more than Descartes himself. Now, Descartes also knew that he was doing this, so to speak, but there's more continuity in Descartes with the traditions he's coming before, the scholastic traditions, the Augustine and the Anselm that he's using, right? But Descartes also says he's doing all this in order to arrive at something firm and constant in the sciences. And he says, if we manage to do this successfully, we will become the masters and possessors of nature. We can conquer nature for the sake of the relief of man's estate. These are the things which he's holding out as possible if we can build on certitude instead of on sand. Previous science has been built upon sand because it wasn't built on certitude, it wasn't mathematical. We can build something mathematical if we build on certainty. And the core of that certainty is this rational doctrine of representation. We talked some previous times about how there's an element of the rational representation notion, which is that we know only what we make. I want to point out that there's another aspect in which it is anticipatory of Heidegger's own phenomenological method, or of Husserl, right? There's an element of anticipating phenomenology here because Descartes is doing this typical modern move of, I do not know if my perceptions of the external things are true, but I do know that it is true that they are my perceptions of the thing, right? Mm-hmm. About that, I can be absolutely certain because it's just about what I perceive. And as long as I restrict my judgments to making statements about what I perceive, I cannot err. All I have to be there is honest. I have to be clear, I have to think distinctly, I have to restrict my judgment about that about which I am certain, and I have to be honest. And if I do those things, I cannot err in that domain. The place where I run into error is where I make judgments where I think that my idea of something has to be similar to the external reality. And the way in which that leads me to error is I judge that before I am certain of it. I judge that they have to be similar just because nature prompts me to think that they are. That's not a sufficient reason. I have to subject them to this thoroughgoing analysis of determining which of them inconvertibly, unshakably follows the other, which one of them is necessary to the other. If there's any way in which this thing can change, if there's any way in which this thing can alter, then if there's any way in which I can doubt it, those are all reasons for not equating them, right? This example of the wax, right? The part that remains is the essential wax, and the parts that change are the inessential wax. And I shouldn't try to make judgments about the inessential wax. I'll get it wrong, right? I don't want to believe that color exists in reality because it's too perspectival. But I can believe that extension and mass exist in reality. So physics should be about extension and math, and should not try to have a theory of color, right? So those are the kinds of things which he's thinking of as are going to move us in the direction of certainty. And I just wanted to point out that there's elements of that which are, because it's talking about not the correspondence between my perceptions of the external world, but my knowledge of them as my perceptions, there's elements of that which are anticipating phenomenological method. And Husserl made much of this. Husserl, Heidegger's teacher, wrote a book called Cartesian Meditations. He knows that his own method is indebted to Descartes in several respects. Okay, I think I mentioned last time that there's one part of this history, as Heidegger tells it, that I think is a stretch, and that Heidegger is making it up. This is the part where he says that the previous scholastic world was focused on the certainty of salvation as opposed to just salvation. I don't think the focus on certainty is there before Descartes. There is concern with certainty even in people like Augustine, certainly, who anticipates Descartes on some of these things. But the focus on certainty is the only way that you can build something that cannot be moved, something that will be a firm and constant structure in the sciences. All of that is Descartes, and it's not there before Descartes. It's not a secularization of some previous religious drive, right? It's Descartes himself. Okay, there's one other weird thing in the Subject of Modern Age chapter, which I don't know if anyone noticed, but this is he goes through these different ideas about dominion over the earth. And here he's kind of looking ahead to Nietzsche and the ways in which Descartes has anticipated Nietzsche. And it has to be understood that Descartes is not as, I'll put it this way, as megamaniacal as Nietzsche is, right? Descartes knows that mankind is finite and man's understanding is limited, and yes, he would like to be the master and possessor of nature to relieve man's estate, and he thinks that that's especially involved in doing enough experiments in medicine to extend people's lifetimes and so forth. But he's not really talking, at least not directly, about assuming absolute dominion over the entire earth. But the other thing that I noticed here is there's a section on end of page 99, start of 100, where he talks about the type and Nietzsche's doctrine of the type. It's worth noticing that there's a previous Enlightenment tradition, so to speak, that was more about individuality or creativity or the genius, etc., which doesn't issue in the type. And there's something new in Nietzsche focusing on the type. He calls the type is what unites in itself in a transformed way the uniqueness that was previously claimed for individuality and the similarity and universality that the community demands. And what are the archetypes of type here? Or the types. The types are Prussian soldiery and the Jesuit order, right? So why? What do people know enough history to know what he means by the Prussian soldiery and the Jesuit order here as types? Was this obscure to people, or?
I'm assuming he was talking about discipline and
partly. He's talking about the fact that there's a sense or impression that regardless of where they came from, regardless of their background, if you take 100 Prussian Vons and send them through the same schools, the same army for years, up the same career ladder, under the same general staff officers, etc., drill them in the same way, what you get out the other end is 100 copies of the same thing. They're all alike one another. They are interchangeable. You can use them like parts in a machine. You can swap out any lieutenant general for any other lieutenant general and put him in charge of anything the lieutenant general is supposed to be in charge of. And there's the same notion of of a disciplined order of the Jesuits. They're all obeying the same hierarchy. They're all of the same type. They all think the same way. They're all like machine products of the social order that constructed them, so to speak. And they are distinct from people of other types, but they're all interchangeable with one another, right? So that's the notion of type that he's getting at here. And there's a way in which this is, what we would later call the organization man or the machine man, right? And it is striking that Nietzsche is speaking of that in a positive vein, because the early Nietzsche is very negative on that kind of thing. The Nietzsche of the era of the Untimely Meditations, is denouncing the ways in which modern education makes men seem like factory products, and this is, why he sees there being no value in them, because there's no individuality in them. There's nothing inventive or genius-like in them, right? He has the conventional 19th century perspectives on the value of individuality at the time that he's in his 20s, and he's still influenced by Schopenhauer in these respects. But by the mature Nietzsche, no. Now he wants to turn people out like coins for particular social roles, to fit into particular new structures of social machinery. Anyway, it's a striking change in Nietzsche himself, that he's gone from one to the other. And Heidegger. Go ahead.
I think it's also true historically. The Prussians. Well, each of these, I think, was, if you say created from a certain machinery, that machinery was created by a large organization for a specific purpose.
Yes.
And the Prussian army that organization was really the asset that helped Prussia expand. Prussia had a few other assets.
Yep.
And then the Jesuits weren't they the Counter-Reformation soldiers for the Catholic Church?
Exactly. So he's thinking of these, you know, top-down hierarchies of the Prussian monarchy or the Catholic Church that create these social machineries for particular purposes of, you know, military or ideological struggle or warfare, and he thinks of those as the truly effective organizations in history or something like that, right? He's more impressed by them than he is by states. Yeah, and you know, I think that it is fair that that is where Nietzsche's overman thinking comes out, because it's a consequence of viewing man as raw material, or as you know, the clay to be shaped by the sculptors designing future mankind, which is sort of what overman is supposed to be. But there's also a kind of disturbing loss of individuality in it, if you could put it that way. From the standpoint of anything like Heideggerian authenticity, right? How authentic is the factory product, right? And Heidegger is not really giving his own reaction to this. He's just explaining Nietzsche's praise of it, so to speak. And he is saying that it is characteristic of the modern age that people view this kind of thing as valuable because of the power effects, or you know, the way in which they help secure positions of dominance, right? And that's, you know, characteristic of modern mankind from his Heidegger's point of view, that this consummate subjectivism is ending in the idea that of man as shapeable raw material for purposes of accumulating power, something like that. He's not really giving you even a negative reaction to that. He's just describing it as what is happening. But anyway, it was striking to me that the subject in the modern age includes this pointer to the subjects at the center of history here don't look like free self-legislating Kantian moral wills, right? They look more like cogs in Prussian and Jesuit hierarchical power machines, right, Joe?
Well, Nietzsche definitely, in his later, more mature years, had lived through witnessing the Prussian Kurfürsten expand to include all of Germany, the German Empire, and then to defeat France.
So I'm gonna.
Nietzsche has to be impressed by this.
Hang on. See, this is the thing, right? What at the time of the Untitled Meditations, Nietzsche has just finished serving in that army that did that. It's already happened.
And hated it, I'm sure. I'm sure he hated
it. You know, he was like a medical orderly, right? You know, hauling back on stretchers the wounded Germans from the Franco-Prussian War, right? His book, published immediately after this, the Untitled Meditations, is, you know, the whole first essay is, you know, describing the jubilation in Germany of the triumphalism about, you know, how German culture has triumphed over French culture, and Nietzsche's reaction is, German culture, no such animal, right? You're barbarians, right? To the extent that there was something like German culture, you know, German music, Heinrich von Kleist, you know, Goethe, right? You trampled on them. You treated them like crap. You were completely useless to them, and that's what won you the war. That was purely a matter of discipline and you know, discipline and bravery, and it didn't have anything to do with culture at all, right? So
it took about 15 years to change his mind. 15 years.
My point is that there's no sign of any kind of worship of Prussian efficiency in the young Nietzsche, right? And his attitudes on the state are extremely negative, even down to Zarathustra. He calls it the coldest of all cold monsters, right? But by the time you're, you know, a few years later, and he's already thinking of how Overman is supposed to reorder the whole Earth. He's now thinking we're going to need some of those power machines. So it is a striking change. Put it that way. Because the early Nietzsche is just so individualist and so cultural elitist, if I can put it that way, that he looks down on everything that overtly political and that power oriented. But the later Nietzsche has gotten completely comfortable with shoveling men around like concrete, if I can put it that way. Brian?
Well, I would just add from the reading of the very first section, the one, I think I was really focused on specific words too much. But the one thing I noticed, and I actually flagged, people in these texts, they talk about man, instead of individual man or groups of men or organizations of men. Mm-hmm. And that's still been kind of a question in the back of my mind, and now you're starting to answer it. And what are we talking, when they use the word man, are they talking individuals or groups? And so I really this is helping me a lot.
Yeah, I mean, mostly when philosophers are talking about the position of man, they're thinking of as the knowing subject, or in a typical epistemological context, or understander of truth kind of context, and they're not thinking of it primarily in this political or action context. But this example on 99-100 definitely is in that context, and it's Nietzsche saying something striking on that with this notion of type. Okay, so let's talk about the how rational is man, right? This is sort of partly the subject of 16, or 16 and 17 in a way, but what's the point? The point is that Heidegger is going to explain that for Descartes, man is the thinking thing, as the center of representation, as the his certainty as the judger of what gets to count as fully being, something like that, is the characteristic Cartesian position. And then Nietzsche's reaction to that is he thinks that that's way too rational, that that's way too turning man into just thought, whereas man is body entirely, so to speak, and drives entirely. So did people have thoughts or reactions on that kind of debate between Descartes and Nietzsche on how thought-like man is? Yes, no?
My two thoughts on that. I thought that, again, looking at the words, I thought that Heidegger chose this word subjectum kind of intentionally, because it's heading into his point about, it's more an ontological view, I think, than a metaphysical. I don't know if you would agree with that or not.
I don't think so. I mean, the part which is somewhat like that is that he does think that the notion of subject as substance, as underlying, as being like or essential, how to put this? He wants to underline that even the move towards subjectivism in modern philosophy is still a doctrine of being, right? They're still talking about, what is. They're just saying that what is first and foremost is something like consciousness, right? But they're still talking about consciousness as the underlying or as the substance. And even though they're talking about that substance now as the subject rather than the substance, they're still thinking of consciousness as the essential substance of history, right? You get that especially in Hegel, right? Hegel will, say, history is the history of absolute spirit, which is the subject of history, right? It's also the substance of truth, right? So they're still trying to talk about what is, would be Heidegger's point, right? That's the sense in which there's more continuity for him between substance and subject than there is for, say, Nietzsche. Nietzsche, at one point, Heidegger even calls this a misunderstanding of Descartes, claims that the substance idea comes from the subject idea, not the other way around, right? by which Nietzsche is trying to say that we psychologically first have the idea of ourselves, and then we arrive at the idea of enduring substance by psychologically projecting the continuity of our own being onto substances outside of ourselves, right? So from Nietzsche's point of view, this is fundamentally a psychological fact, right? What order do they come in? The notion of subject as unity of a consciousness through time, or the notion of substance as a material, an enduring material thing. And Nietzsche is trying to make the point that psychologically, we understand the interior subject version of that first. What Heidegger is pointing out is that in the actual history of philosophy, it worked the other way, right? In the actual history of philosophy, people were talking about substance, right, ousia, right, and being, long before they were talking about subject as anything like the interior of consciousness. And the focus to the interior of consciousness came because they were going through some notion of being and thinking as being in correspondence with each other or being the same, and that led them towards positing, contents of consciousness or certain contents of consciousness as in some way the judge of the truth of things, something like that. But that's in the history of philosophy. Subject in the sense of interior consciousness definitely comes later, and substance as that which beings has definitely comes first, which is the opposite of Nietzsche's view. Nietzsche is just describing things from his own position, in which psychology comes first, will to power comes first, the way the world looks from the inside comes first. And Heidegger is saying it may come first for you, but that's only because you're at the very end of metaphysics, right? The whole history of metaphysics has been, way less subjective than that. And it's only because you're the most consummate subjective thing that's ever happened that you think that the subject comes first in the sense of the interior of consciousness coming first. It's the apotheosis of subjectivism that you think that the subject comes first. It's not something that's a matter of course through the whole history. Anyway, so the point there is that Heidegger is disagreeing with Nietzsche, at least insofar as Nietzsche is trying to understand history or understand Descartes. But Heidegger, doesn't see, he thinks Nietzsche is falsifying the previous history because he's looking at it with his own glasses. And his point is not that he's falsifying the history. He doesn't really care about that. His point is that this is how everything looks through Nietzsche's glasses. Through Nietzsche's glasses, psychology is always first, right? You're always viewing things from the inside first. And that's just evidence that Nietzsche's philosophy is the metaphysics of subjectivity, right? Okay. I want to mention a couple things about the willing pole in Descartes, because in a way, Nietzsche is claiming that Descartes made man too rational and made him just a thinking thing and just a mind, and that Nietzsche, is going to show that actually no, it's the drives and affects that matter more than thinking, right? So the curious thing here is to ask, before Nietzsche, where did all these different thinkers and philosophers put drives and affects? Because it's not like he's the first person who ever noticed that we have drives and affects as well as rational thought. So first answer, before we're even at Descartes, we're at the source that Descartes gets his I think deduction from in Augustine, right? Right after Augustine says that he knows that he exists and he is a thinking thing, he also says, and I know that I love, right? The affect is an equally apparent thing internally known to Augustine, and the term used for it is love, and particularly love of the good, because he's a Platonist, right? In Descartes, instead, he talks about a thought or judgment and the will. And the will there is a free will. Now there's a free will in Augustine too, so he's not just deviating from the source, but he's dropped the love part and now he's talking about it as the will part. And what the will does primarily for Descartes is judge. It chooses this or that as good or bad, and it also judges this or that as true or false. And he almost equates those things with one another. So will is the faculty that judges that this is true as opposed to false, or that this thing corresponds to an external reality. It posits, it represents in that sense. It's also what judges that this is good rather than bad, and that's treated as almost the same kind of cognitive operation. You're just deciding that this is true. You're just deciding that this is good. Joe.
Well, I seem to recall that Hume had a sort of a three-way division of the mind: will, judgment, and gosh, I'm embarrassed. But there were three parts.
Which there are in Plato too. Plato is the original tripartitioner, right?
That's okay. Then Hume is not okay. That's a good point. And
so the original tripartition in Platonic understanding is you have eros as just desire, right? You have nous or thought or mind, and between them you have spiritedness or thumos, the anger, which is what later becomes will, right? But it's just the kind of forceful mental strength, something like that. But the word for it is anger or spirit. It's how much chest does the man have? That's how spirited he is, right? As opposed to desire, which is equated with the belly, and the and the mind, which is equated with the head. So the Platonic version has three seats. You have the head up here. You have the chest, which is the seat of the anger or will, and you have the belly, which is the seat of the drives, right, as the lowest and most animal. But by the time you're at Descartes, he's just talking about mind and will it judges of good and bad. And it judges incorrectly when it judges something as good, which is bad for you, right? So it's already got this mental correctness aspect. It's not a choice. It's there's a objective better and worse. And when you judge that the good is actually good, you've judged correctly and otherwise incorrectly, right? But there is a will that is distinct from mind. And he says that the mind is finite, very limited, understands very little, whereas the will is infinite. It will judge or choose about anything, even when it doesn't know, right? And to Descartes, the source of error is when we let the will go and let it act or judge where we have no certainty or no knowledge of what is good for us, right? Which amounts to saying something like, when our very limited mind, when we keep our actions within the sphere of our very limited minds, we do not err either in intellect or in morals. But as soon as we act willfully outside of the sphere where we know, we err both morally and intellectually. So that's the notion of affect or will that you have in Descartes. Now, this is not quite enough for people right after Descartes, like Leibniz, and he puts, perception and appetite as the two things which all monads have. And so he sort of brings appetite back a bit, right? And he calls it appetite, not love. It was love in Augustine, but it becomes appetite in Leibniz. And by the time you're at Schopenhauer, right? Now you've got will as this big contrary thing to representation, which is in a way more fundamental than representation. And representation is just this abstract machinery that Kant had described. And will is this free thing that Kant had also described, but it's now for Schopenhauer a kind of more underlying blind thing. Before you know anything, you have will, and it's something like life drives, and it's also tragic because he's a pessimist. The will is not going to get what it wants. It wants things, but it's blind and uninformed, and the things that it wants it can't have, because a finite will can never be actually satisfied in this life. Something like that. The will wants infinitely. That was already there in Fichte. The will wants whatever it wants to become true. It wants to be omnipotent. And Schopenhauer says, yes, it wants to be omnipotent, and it's doomed to fail, right? So young Nietzsche is brought up on a notion of will, which has this character that it is stridently contrasted with representation as a kind of disembodied knowing, and also plagued with futility, right? And Nietzsche rebels against that as being far too pessimistic, and he's going to overturn the moral ordering of those, if I can put it that way. To Schopenhauer, your representation is what's rational about you and safe, and your will is what is, tragic and foolish about you. And Nietzsche's going to say your will is what is alive about you, even when it's, making mistakes, and your reason is a mere tool of the drives, right? And it ought to be treated as a tool, and if it's made to be more than a tool, it's just going to damp down your will to live and frustrate your actual purposes and make you weaker, and all these bad things, right? So mature Nietzsche is overturning Schopenhauer, which already had this strong dichotomy between will and representation, and now will is way more important than representation to Nietzsche. So in a way, he's projecting that back on Descartes, and he sees Descartes did also have a will alongside the representation, but from Nietzsche's point of view, that's all representation. All of Descartes is just the rule of representation. He's so rational, he's trying to pretend that man is just the purely rational mind, and the will he's added there is just this little choosing engine that is supposed to stay within carefully prescribed bounds so that it doesn't overstep, right? And Nietzsche is all about the overstepping, right? If the overstepping and being alive are the same thing to Nietzsche. I just wanted to trace that out. It's not like these other people had no notion of the drives or where they put it. Each one of them had a different notion of the non-rational, the drives in man. And Nietzsche isn't simply talking about that for the first time. What he's doing is he's putting it on top, whereas previously it was always put in one or another form of subordinate position. And he's now saying that the reason is a tool of the body, of the drives, and the drives and what they want. Yes, they're in a way unlimited. The unlimitedness of the will to power drive is as much there as the infinite drive was in Fichte, right? Or the unlimited will was in Descartes. Descartes viewed the fact that the will was unlimited and way out of proportion to our limited understanding as the way we make all the mistakes we ever make, including all the moral mistakes we ever make, right? But for Nietzsche, making mistakes is not the point. Succeeding is the point, and you don't succeed by avoiding all possible mistakes. Avoiding all possible mistakes results in inaction and impotence. Anyway, so that's some stuff on the non-cogito aspects of man. Do we want to talk at all about what Nietzsche himself thought about why he wasn't a Cartesian? I don't know how much of people have already read Nietzsche themselves. If you haven't read Nietzsche himself, it's probably useful to see why he, lots of people read Descartes or even the Augustine before Descartes, and they find the, I think therefore I am argument reasonably convincing. And Nietzsche famously doesn't. He's not convinced by it at all. So is anyone interested in why he's not convinced by it? Brian is waving his hand saying yes. Okay.
Yes.
So the whole first
I'm interested in it, but I think I'd like you to talk about it because I'm going to read about it in the next several days.
Yes, I will talk about it, but I'm going to read a little bit first to give you something to react to, right? That is read out loud. But this is from Beyond Good and Evil. The whole first section is on the prejudices of philosophers, right? And the sort of main topic of the whole first section of Beyond Good and Evil is that philosophers have whitewashed the world and moralized too much and pretended that all their morals and motives were pure, and they've falsified things by always trying to be the good guys and that sort of thing. Okay, and they're also by being naive about how much they knew or something like that. Okay, let us suppose that knowledge means knowing things entirely. The philosopher must say to himself, when I analyze the process that is expressed in the sentence, I think, I find a whole series of daring assertions that it would be difficult, perhaps impossible, to prove. For example, that it is I who think, that there must necessarily be something that thinks, that thinking is an activity and an operation on the part of a being who is thought of as a cause, that there is an ego, and finally, that it is already determined what is to be designated by thinking, that I know what thinking is. For if I had not already decided within myself what it is, by what standard could I determine whether or not what was just happening is not perhaps willing or feeling instead of thinking? In short, the assertion I think assumes that I compare my state at the present moment with other states of myself which I know, in order to determine what it is. On account of this retrospective connection with further knowledge, it has, at any rate, no immediate certainty for me. It is always mediate. In place of the immediate certainty in which people may believe in the case at hand, the philosopher thus finds a series of metaphysical questions presented to him, truly searching questions of the intellect, to wit, from where do I get the concept of thinking? Why do I believe in cause and effect? What gives me the right to speak of an ego, or even of an ego as a cause, and finally of an ego as a cause of thought? Whoever ventures to answer these metaphysical questions at once by an appeal to any sort of intuitive perception, like the person who says, I think and I know that this at least is true, actual, and certain, will encounter a smile and 2 question marks from the philosophers nowadays. Sir, the philosopher will perhaps give him to understand, it is improbable that you are mistaken, but why insist upon the truth? In other words, he sees problems in all those things which seem obvious, certain to Descartes. Now he's going to say the same thing about will. He's thinking now of Schopenhauer, that people think of will as the simplest thing in the world, right? But it seems to him that he has only done what philosophers are always in the habit of doing. He adopted a popular prejudice and exaggerated it. Willing seems to me to be above all something complicated, something that is a unit only as a word. And it's precisely in this one word that the popular prejudice lurks, which has defeated the always inadequate caution of philosophers. So let us for once be more cautious. Let us be unphilosophical. Let us say that in all willing there is, first, a plurality of sensations, the sensation of a state away from which, the sensation of the state towards which, the sensation of this from and towards themselves, and then also an accompanying muscular sensation, which, even without our putting into motion arms and legs, begins its action by force of habit as soon as we will anything. Just as sensations, therefore, can be recognized ingredients of will, so secondly is thinking also. In every act of will, there is a ruling thought. Let us not imagine it possible to sever this thought from the willing, as if any will would then remain left over. Okay, the point is he's going to go through, he's unbundling each of these things and finding lots of psychological complexity hiding behind single words and illusions of grammar, right? Okay. And then of that psychology itself, he'll say, all psychology so far has gotten stuck in moral prejudices and fears. It has not dared to descend into the depths. To understood it as morphology in the doctrine of the development of will to power as I do, nobody has yet come close to doing this even in thought, insofar as it is permissible to recognize what has been written so far as a symptom of what has been kept silent. The power of moral prejudices has penetrated deeply into the most spiritual world, which would seem to be the coldest and the most devoid of presuppositions, and has obviously operated in an injurious, inhibiting, blinding, and distorting manner. A proper physiopsychology has to contend with unconscious resistance in the heart of the investigator. It has the heart against it. Even a doctrine of the reciprocal dependence of the good and the wicked drives, causes, as refined immorality, distress and aversion in a still hale and hearty conscience. Still more so, a doctrine of the derivation of all good impulses from wicked ones. If, however, a person should regard even the effects of hatred, envy, covetousness, and the lust to rule as conditions of life, as factors which fundamentally and essentially must be present in the general economy of life, and must therefore be further enhanced if life is to be further enhanced, he will suffer from such a view of things as from seasickness. And yet, even this hypothesis is far from being the strangest or the most painful in this immense and almost new domain of dangerous insights. And there are, in fact, 100 good reasons why everyone should keep away from it who can. On the other hand, if one has drifted there with one's bark, well, all right, let us clench our teeth. Let us open our eyes and keep our hand firm on the helm. We sail right over morality. We crush, we destroy perhaps the only remains of our own morality by daring to make our voyage there. But what matter are we? Never did a profounder world of insight reveal itself to the daring traveler and adventurer, and the psychologist who thus makes the sacrifice will at least be entitled to demand in return that psychology shall be recognized again as the queen of the sciences for whose service and preparations the other sciences exist. For psychology is now again the path to the fundamental problems. His point being that he wants to discover new things about human psychology, and the way that he is expecting to discover them is by dropping a lot of moralizing claptrap and finding out how the mechanism actually works. And the way the mechanism is actually going to work is going to have everything to do with evolutionary drives and a lot of hacks and a lot of evil and a lot of stuff that wouldn't pass muster at the Salvation Army seminar, right? But that are real. And he wants to understand human nature, human motivation, human psychology that way. And he is contemptuously dismissive of any attempt to understand it as less complicated or more clean or more pure than that's going to take, than that way of looking at it is going to see it, right? So you can see how much this influenced like later psychologies of the unconscious, like Freud and Jung and all this, right? But he's got a basic suspicious skeptical notion that any view of mankind that paints him as decidedly rational, having perfect access to the truth, having an easy way of regulating his will, having access to the eternal moral standard, always being good, all good things following from the good will, and all evil things following from the evil will. He has no patience for that. He thinks it's just pap. There's no way human beings or nature are like that to him. So anyway, that's the basic reason why when he looks at an earlier thinker like Descartes, he finds someone whitewashing the psychology of thinking and vastly oversimplifying it. Does that make sense? Okay, reactions to any of that?
Well, or hasn't modern psychology proven he was pretty much right with that? That it's a lot deeper, that we really don't understand our drives and our will?
So to some degree, yes. Plenty of modern psychology has gone in that direction or has learned from that direction. Plenty of it is also learned from the kinds of stuff that Heidegger explained in Being in Time and some of the structures there. But not all of it, right? Not all of it. I mean, some of Nietzsche's attitude here is like, the more shocking something is to the moral sensibilities of the 19th century bourgeois, the more likely it is to be true, right? And that's okay. Probably not true either, right?
Right.
It's probably not the case that you can just use what people regard as shocking as an index for how true something is, right? There's also probably a lot of historical and even evolutionary truth and sense in morality. There's probably a lot of it that's adaptive. Societies didn't evolve those standards just because they wanted to distort the truth. They also wanted to act in ways that actually work cooperatively with one another, right? And although his method is certainly open to such findings, it's not the direction of his suspicion, right? So he's kind of not prepared to find moralizing or uplifting truths. He's only prepared to find the opposite. But partly that's because he thinks all the moralizing truths have already been found, and it's the immoral ones that have been hidden, right? He has a famous reaction to Voltaire, right? He says, "Oh Voltaire, oh humaneness, oh nonsense. There is something about truth, and when a man says," and he quotes Voltaire saying, "I seek the true only in order to do the good," and Nietzsche reacts to that by saying, "I bet he finds nothing." Right? So that kind of suspicious, doubting, playful, evil, character is there in Nietzsche, and he thinks that that's part of scientific attitude. He thinks that's part of being willing to face things, and that there's a lot of moralizing, hiding from yourself in the past. If you can put it that way. And there's enough truth in that it was fruitful in psychology to relax that a bit, so to speak. But it can definitely also be taken overboard and can be used to defend all kinds of indefensible things. And so I think that I don't even want to say it was probably useful at the time. There were elements of truth in it. It certainly influenced a lot of other people, not all of them in good ways. Let's put it that way.
Right. Yeah.
But is it true that human psychology is not that we are unitary rational actors who only judge of things we're certain of them? Yes. Right. Talking about actual human cognitive psychology, right? We don't even see things that don't matter to us, that aren't subject to the task at hand. You can find all kinds of later cognitive psych effects that are in keeping with this. Fair question. Okay. There are things on the Descartes Protagoras chapter, and then again in 20 in the Nietzsche Descartes chapters, 18 and 20, where he just he kind of puts both of them in the same structure. He's going to say, on our 4 different questions, he's harping back to the whole structure of metaphysics he laid out at the very beginning of this book. How does each of them come out, right? So it's like we can have a notion of man, a notion of the beingness of beings, a notion of truth, and a way in which man is the measure, right? In Protagoras contrasted with Descartes, or in Descartes contrasted with Nietzsche. And it's probably worth going over these and seeing if each of these propositions is clearly intelligible to people, because it's kind of summing up the whole section to see these two side by side.
Is this chapter 20?
So the first version is in 18, where it's Protagoras and Descartes, and then it happens in 20 for Descartes and Nietzsche. So yes, the numbers 1 through 4 in chapter 20, which is on pages 136 and 137, and then also the numbers 1 and 4 at the end of chapter 18 on page 122. So let's start on 122, right? For Protagoras, man in his selfhood is defined by his belonging to the radius of the unconcealed. For Descartes, man as self is defined by referring the world backs to man's representing. So those are both the notion of man in the 2 different metaphysical positions. 2, for Protagoras, the beingness of beings in the sense of the Greek metaphysics is a coming to presence in the unconcealed. For Descartes, beingness means representedness through and for the subject. 3, for Protagoras, truth, this is now, that was the notion of being, now we're on the notion of truth. 3, for Protagoras, truth means the unconcealment of what is present. For Descartes, the certitude of self-representing and securing representation. And then 4, for Protagoras, man is the measure of all things in the sense of a measured restriction to the radius of the unconcealed and to the boundaries of the concealed. For Descartes, man is the measure of all things in the sense of the presumption of the limitation of representation for self-securing certitude. The standard of measure places everything that can pass as a being under the reckoning of representation. Or in my gloss, to be is to be thinkable. Okay, that's the Protagoras Descartes contrast. And in each one of them, you're seeing a contrast, but I want you to also notice that he's filling out this form, so to speak, for each of these contrasts. The 4 terms in the form, man, meaning of being, understanding of truth, and this, in what sense the measure, that is coming from Heidegger. That's a structure of metaphysics that Heidegger is saying you can fill out for any metaphysical position. It's like, in the the linguists have a sheet, which is like, you want to understand a language, you fill out this sheet about the structure of its grammar, and you have how many tenses it has, and does it use declensions, and what kinds of nouns does it have, and you just fill out a form, and the structure of it. Structuralism is the idea that there are such forms for each of these kinds of thought structures. And this is, in a way, one of the original versions of the structures that later became structuralism, right? There's this structure of each of them has a doctrine of man being truth. So let's jump ahead to 136 now and see what they offer the Descartes-Nietzsche contrast. For Descartes,
when I read this, I thought,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, when I read this, both of these, I thought, if I'm a student in Heidegger's class, this is the essay question on the exam.
Yes. It's short answer essay, right?
Yeah.
For Descartes, man is subject in the sense of, this is now 136. Man is subject in the sense of representing I-ness. For Nietzsche, man is subject in the sense of drives and affects present before us as the ultimate fact. That is, in short, the body. In such recourse to the body as the metaphysical guideline, all world interpretation is pursued. Okay, then 2. For Descartes, the beingness of being is equivalent to representativeness through and for the I subject. For Nietzsche, 2. Being is indeed representativeness, but being conceived as permanence is not sufficient for grasping a proper being, that is, something that becomes in its reality as becoming. Being as the firm and fixed is merely the semblance of becoming, but a necessary semblance. The proper character of the being of the real as becoming is will to power. It requires an explicit and substantive demonstration to show how far Nietzsche's interpretation of being as a whole as will to power is rooted in the previously mentioned subject of drives and affects, and at the same time is essentially co-determined through the projection of beingness representedness. I'll come back to this, but then for Descartes, the truth notions. Truth means the same as secure conveyance of what is represented in self-representing representation. Truth is certitude. For Nietzsche, truth is equivalent to taking for true. The true is defined by what man makes of the being and what he takes as being. Being is permanence or fixedness. Taking for true is the making fast of becoming, a fixation through which something permanent is secured for a living creature, both in himself and for his surroundings. By virtue of it, he can be secure in his existence and his continuance, and thus have control over the enhancement of power. For Nietzsche, truth as fixation is the semblance needed by the living creature, that is, by the power center of the body as subject. Okay. We can go back to 4 if you want, but those to me are the essential ones. And I want to point out a commonality in that 3 in particular. Descartes, truth is certitude as self-representing representation, and for Nietzsche, truth is taking for true or what it means to me, right? What both those have in common is both of them are positings. In both of them, the subject posits what is true. In the case of Descartes, it posits it as the representation of what he can be certain of, and he avoids judgment on anything he can't be certain of. In the case of Nietzsche, it's wider than that. It's whatever you're taking to be true. It's not as constrained by certainty, but you're treating it as certain. You're treating it as fixed. It's whatever you are going to treat as fixed for whatever your purposes are. So in a sense, truth is a more willful thing for Nietzsche, something more willing to be wrong, so to speak, but both of them share that they are positings by the subject. Both of them agree that the true is the posited. Descartes just thinks the true is the posited by the mind that restricts itself to what it can posit with certainty, and Nietzsche thinks the true is the posited for the being doing the positing for its purposes, right? Which may be, approximations, maybe mythical, maybe ideological, whatever. Okay. There's one other thing I wanted to read you from the Nietzsche stuff about the physiology, because there's a little paradox here of the subject as body that I want you to know that Nietzsche is aware of. This is 15 in the first part of Young and Evil. To study physiology with a clear conscience, one must insist that the sense organs are not phenomena in the sense of idealistic philosophy. As such, they could not be causes. That is, they were only their appearances to the mind. They wouldn't actually be causes. They have to be actual things. Sensualism, therefore, at least as a regulative hypothesis, if not as a heuristic principle. What? And others even say that the external world is the work of our organs, but then our body, as a part of this external world, would be the work of our organs. But then our organs themselves would be the work of our organs. It seems that, to me, that this is a complete reductio ad absurdum, assuming that the concept of a self-cause is something fundamentally absurd. Consequently, the external world is not the work of our organs? Question mark. Anyway, that's so that you know that he knows that there's something paradoxical in wanting to have this exterior positivistic scientistic view of mankind as just this meat machine with reactions to things, and at the same time wanting to view the whole world from inside as will to power, right? There is something a little bit not quite contradictory in those things, but a little bit strange in those things, because one is an entirely from the outside scientific positivist view, and the other is entirely from the inside drives view. And physiology is the place where those two views meet, right? So you have to ask yourself: is your notion of the biological reflex arc something which you're merely positing for your purposes as will to power, or is it something which is an evolved dead machine that just happens to produce will-like effects? And the suspension of the tension between those two is characteristic of and necessary to Nietzsche, right? He's not going to decide between them for you. Okay. Any further reactions to the later chapters and the parts of where, I mean, there's things at the end of 20 where he thinks he's vindicated that Nietzsche fits in the structure of metaphysics that he laid out, and therefore he can call Nietzsche metaphysics, a piece of metaphysics, not something that has gone beyond or overcome metaphysics. He says, we must provisionally indicate the essential ground of the historicity of the history of metaphysics as the history of the truth of being. Such an indication at the same time allows us to clarify a distinction that has already been employed several times. The distinction between conditioned and absolute subjectivity. By the way, Nietzsche is the absolute subjectivity pole of that. This distinction is also tacitly presupposed with the final remark presented here as more than a mere assertion, although it's only a mere assertion. As the fulfillment of modern metaphysics, Nietzsche's metaphysics is at the same time the fulfillment of Western metaphysics in general, and is thus, in a correctly understood sense, the end of metaphysics as such. So this is a giant claim at the end of 20. And I put it, so far it's just a claim. It has there's evidence for it in the fact that he's shown that Nietzsche fits into his scheme, but he hasn't shown you that, well, what's he trying to say here? He's trying to say that modern metaphysics itself is already the metaphysics of at least conditional subjectivity. Nietzsche's metaphysics is the metaphysics of unconditional subjectivity. In that sense, Nietzsche's metaphysics is the culmination of modern metaphysics. Second claim, all of modern metaphysics is, a culmination of the history of metaphysics as such. He hasn't shown that yet. He hasn't shown that, Descartes coming out of Plato was a necessary development or anything like that. And the way that he almost has shown that the development of Nietzsche out of Descartes is an almost necessary development. Okay, but he's trying to make the claim that the fundamental possibilities of metaphysics as this schema of my four things that I'm filling out has been exhausted. We've rung through all its changes. We've seen all of its phases. We've seen all of its possibilities. And then he, in the later sections that we're going to read for next time, he'll say that doesn't mean that there won't be people thinking metaphysically in the future, right? It doesn't mean that metaphysics is over in some simple sense. He even gives some indications of what it might mean. It might mean that people treat past metaphysical views as just the raw material for their worldviews. Why are they going to be thinking in terms of worldviews? The answer is they're going to stay Nietzscheans for quite some time, right? And from a Nietzschean perspective, all of these different past metaphysics are just different moralizing doctrines for the sake of this or that power construction, which means they're all just, in the Marxist sense, ideologies that justify this or that power constellation or power formation. So worldviews. You're going to get different worldviews which are expressions of different interests. And that notion that that's what you're going to get and that that's what philosophy has reduced itself to, a set of tools for power accumulation and power differentiation by different armed camps. That is Nietzsche's diagnosis of where you're going to be, or it's Heidegger's diagnosis of what the world will continue to look like as long as we remain simply Nietzschean. Something like that. And all the previous positions in metaphysics are going to be contrasted with that just as raw material for positions of that kind. So he's giving you a prediction there. Nobody's going to go back to Thomism, but they'll use Thomism as the basis of a worldview that will Nietzschean style compete with other worldviews by waving its flag for its interests. And the same will be done with Platonism, and the same will be done with Cartesianism, and the same will be done with Neo-Kantianism, whatever. All the previous philosophies are just going to turn into so many different ideological camps, which just express the will to power of this or that interest group that is rallied around that flag. But they're all Nietzscheans, waving their flags in their different Nietzschean camps. That's the idea that what the future of metaphysical philosophy is worldviews, Weltanschauung philosophy. He does think that it's possible for something other than that to result from thinking about confronting, if I can put it that way, Nietzschean philosophy of this whole history. But the default is not that everyone is Nietzschean in the sense that everybody accepts Nietzsche's whole history of philosophy, or tries to organize society around the idea of the overman. That's not what it means for the world to be Nietzschean to Heidegger. What it means for the world to be Nietzschean is we get Weltanschauung philosophy, we get worldview philosophy, we get different ideological camps that are basically warring interests of power structures against each other in entirely Nietzschean terms, along with some, continually accelerating nihilism about it all. And that's what that's what we should expect as what will happen if nothing else succeeds metaphysics, right? So that's when he talks about the end of metaphysics. He's not talking about a rosy thing that is going to come afterwards as soon as everyone reads Being in Time and it issues in some, easy exit to the plane of the truth of being, which everyone will understand, even though 13 years after he wrote it, he didn't manage to understand it himself by his own confession, right? He's expecting something more problematic than that. And for most of the West, they're still not even digesting this, right? They don't know that they're living in a Nietzschean world. They don't know that they're living at the end of metaphysics, but they are. They don't know that the worldviews they're living in are now just, Nietzschean power centers of this or that ideology expressing this or that interest as the projected psychological wills and drives of whatever living group ascribes to that view, but that's what they're doing. And from Heidegger's point of view, if people manage to think up to the level of Nietzsche's metaphysics, they can at least get to the point that they're conscious that that's where they're living. And until they're conscious that that's where they're living, there's no thought exit from that living, right? Thought exit from that living only begins to become possible if people are conscious that that's where they're already living. All right. So I want to partly answer Pete's question now, right? That's the sense in which I think that having read this book is necessary to be participating in a conversation about where we are in the modern world. I think that people like the postmodernists are already trying to think in those terms, some of them more confusedly than others, some of them more stuck in phases along that line than others. But that whole periodization is thinking in those terms. And you can't even know that there are people who think of the present historical situation in these historical period terms if you haven't digested at least this much Nietzsche and Heidegger. Go, Joe.
About a year or slightly more than that ago, you said that it's necessary to understand Heidegger before one can even begin to approach understanding where the postmoderns come from.
Correct.
And now it seems like at first it's necessary to understand Nietzsche to understand where the postmoderns come from. How does Heidegger, I mean, well, okay, I appreciate, but do you have to understand Nietzsche through the filter of Heidegger to make sense of Nietzsche? Or can Nietzsche...
Not to make sense of Nietzsche. You could, plenty of people make sense of Nietzsche without having read Heidegger, but I don't think anyone understands the periodization of postmodernism or the idea that there even is such a thing as postmodernism unless they have understood Heidegger reacting to Nietzsche. I think what the postmodernists have in common, including people who wouldn't even call themselves postmodernists, but are in the same dialogue with the postmodernists, sometimes antagonistically, right? That whole conversation / fight is only happening among people who are already thinking about whether or not there is or is not any exit from Nietzscheanism.
Right.
And by Nietzscheanism, I don't mean being a convinced Nietzschean. I mean living in a world in which all grand meta-narratives and all thought structures and all metaphysics is all thought of as a construct of domination for the sake of the power interests of this or that group, Weltanschauung philosophy, right? That ideological view of what thought formations now are is the leftover Nietzscheanism from which postmodernism starts. Go ahead, Joe.
As just sort of a final curiosity, does Heidegger is he simply telling us, okay, this is where you've dumped into now, you've been thrown into this world of craziness, postmodernism, because everybody's Nietzschean now, but does he actually, in his critique of Nietzsche, as just a historical step, and one of these historical stages or whatever Heidegger might label that as, does he see any light at the end of this future, confusion? Does he offer anything?
From his own philosophy, absolutely.
That's a question.
But to be clear, the world he thinks people are living in now, the world of worldview philosophies, the world of technology, the world of consummate and absolute subjectivity, right? All of that is not simply people agreeing with Nietzsche. It's just them living in a world that is accurately described by Nietzsche's philosophy, right? Their agreement is completely irrelevant to the matter, right? It's not that he thinks that you're going to be surrounded by Nietzschean disciples. He just thinks that you're going to be living in a world that is accurately characterized by either Nietzsche's own diagnosis or his own understanding of where Nietzsche's diagnosis leads you to exit, right? Which is this worldview philosophy / technology / instrumental view of all human thought as just being for the sake of ordering man's society as he struggles for dominion over the earth, right? As the power struggle between warring fundamental philosophies. That diagnosis of where we're going to be in the as Nietzsche put it, the history of the next 2 centuries, right, is what Heidegger means by living in a Nietzschean world, right? And you can call that living in nihilism, or you can call it living in a Nietzschean world. Same thing on this from this point of view. What Heidegger is claiming is that there is no possible thoughtful exit from that situation without fully understanding what it is and how you got there, which he thinks he is providing, right? He is not claiming that as soon as you have understood it, you have exited from it. He knows that that is not the case. But he does think you're not exiting it without understanding it.
So he could basically say, okay, students, now it's time for you to go back and study Being in Time again and read it more carefully.
Yes. There's a famous set of lectures he gave in the 50s called What is Called Thinking, where he deals with a single saying of Nietzsche. The single saying of Nietzsche is, the wasteland grows, woe to them who hide wastelands within, right? So he gives a semester-long lecture course, on a gloss on that. And there's a throwaway line in there, not throwaway line, place in that, he's trying to explain all this stuff about Nietzsche, and he says, we're going to go over this Nietzsche, but Nietzsche is hard. You should not start with Nietzsche. You should first, if you're serious about this stuff, study Aristotle for 10 to 15 years. Right? And then he proceeds to go on with the entire lecture course about this one line of Nietzsche, right? Go ahead, Joe.
Well, is that, of course, that must be available in a printed form, I hope.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of his more famous books and one of his more accessible
I hope
books.
you'll give us the reference in one of these times, but not right this minute.
Sure. The name of it is What is Called Thinking in English. Simple. But why did he want you to go read Aristotle for 10 to 15 years? The answer is, if you want to understand the history of metaphysics, you have to know what metaphysics is, and the place for you to find out what metaphysics is in the first place is Aristotle's Metaphysics, where he defines it. And Aristotle's Metaphysics is a difficult book that assumes that you know lots of other Aristotle, so it's going to be a while, right, from his point of view, right? We will instead be reading Gilson. That's my substitute for 10 or 15 years of Aristotle. It's just 6 months of Gilson, right?
I've read the first chapter of Gilson, or at least most of it, and I like where he's starting, but I didn't have time to continue with Gilson. Now I will.
Yeah. Okay, so I hope that was helpful in summarizing, why we care about this stuff. Let's talk a little about next time. So the very next couple of chapters are a lot about this. Is there any place to go next, right? This is Man and Truth, which is summing up where you think subjectivity leads you. The end of metaphysics, where the fundamental point is to grasp Nietzsche's philosophy as the metaphysics of subjectivity. And then there's the whole thing about the ontological difference, where he's trying to lay out this whole structure that he has been using throughout just as its own thing. So he's just going to, instead of giving you examples about how other people fit into this scheme, he's just going to talk about the scheme. That's chapter 23, right? And in a way, those things all form a section. Those are summing up what we've done getting here. The remainder is going to take us in a different direction. It's going to take us back to Plato and try to understand the origin of valuative thought in Nietzsche as being related to pre-modern metaphysics. Joe?
Yeah, I'm not trying to interfere with your plan, but if there's a break point between 23 and 24, as a personal preference, I would beg to break at 23 so that I can have, because I have to read all of the previous that I didn't yet get to after once again doing this. Well,
I understand your desire, but I'm reluctant to assign an entire section on 19 pages for everyone else.
I appreciate, and therefore I thank you very much. I understand your thing.
I just think 19 pages isn't enough for a session.
Understood. But it does start at 24. It does start at 24.
Yeah, 21 to 23 is that summing up section that's going to get us to the whole structure of metaphysics thing that he's been laying out. So what's the point? He's shown that that's true of Descartes and Nietzsche. He's sketched how it's also there in a way in Protagoras. But he still hasn't sewn this back to the past. He still hasn't shown that this notion of metaphysics goes all the way back to early Greek metaphysics, goes back to Plato and Aristotle. So the remaining thing he has to do is show that Nietzsche's metaphysics is not just a culmination of modern metaphysics, it's not just a logical consequence of Descartes, but to show that it's a consequence of metaphysics tout court, to show that it's a consequence of metaphysics going back to Plato and Aristotle. So the next ambitious thing he's got to do is show that, yes, Nietzsche is the metaphysics of consummate subjectivity and is the end of modern metaphysics. He's also the end of metaphysics, period, because, what's the because?
We have ontology now. It's more
Well,
thorough.
But no, the because is going to be something like, because Nietzsche comes out at valuative thought for reasons which you can already see forming in Plato. That there's precursors already in Plato that wind up turning into valuative thought by the time you're at Nietzsche. Now, he will tell you straight up, there's no way that Plato thought in valuative thought terms, right? That's Nietzsche, it's original to Nietzsche, that's not what he's claiming. What he is claiming is that there is an understanding of being in the light of the good in Plato that is the prefiguration, the structural precursor, the thing being echoed in the structure of being he's laying out, or sorry, structure of metaphysics he's laying out, that was already the seed for where Nietzsche ended up. So he's trying to show a unity in the whole history of metaphysics since Plato, or otherwise put, he's trying to establish that metaphysics is Platonism, right? This is a claim he has not, made yet, right? He has not, none of the stuff he's given us on Nietzsche alone have been detailed enough about people like Plato and Aristotle to sustain a claim like Nietzsche is not just the end of modern metaphysics, he's the end of metaphysics, and he's a natural, all of modern metaphysics is a natural development from where Plato and Aristotle started. He's going to try to do that in a very short period of time, right? So being as the a priori, being as idea and agathon and condition, that's 25, like one chapter, bam. Being as idea and valuative thought, which is trying to show the relationship between the Platonic notion and the Nietzschean notion of what stands over against being as good or value. And then he wants to show in 27 that being as will to power is a projection of the nature of being that is fully consistent with the other projections of the nature of being that we got before. Okay. All of that through 27 is basically trying to tie everything he's done back to the past, back to Plato and Aristotle, back to Platonism. The remaining chapters are a sketch of supposing all that is to be established, supposing all that to be true, so that we can say we're at the end not of modern metaphysics, but of metaphysics. Where are we going next, right? So, and this is very preliminary, very sketchy, right? You're only going to get a very sketchy. But that's what you're getting in the last couple of chapters. So the meat of the section ahead of us is first, there's a summing up of what he's done to show you the structure of modern metaphysics. And then there's going back to Plato and focus especially on the being as idea of the good in Plato, and the relation of that to the idea of value in Nietzsche, right? That's the core thing in this section we're going to do next. Okay, I want to wrap in like 10 minutes, but give you guys a chance for questions. Steve, any questions?
No more questions. That summary was great. Prepare me to read the next section.
Good. Brian?
Can you still hear me? I can hear but not see.
I can hear you, yes.
Oh, we can see you.
We can see and hear you.
I'm good. I'm good.
Okay. Joe?
I'm eager to proceed, and since I only have a lot of work to do in 2 weeks, I'm going to start immediately.
Well, this is the next question. Do we want to do 2 weeks or 3? Because this is 60 odd pages. You have a little bit more to do. We could do 3 weeks for this. Let's go for 3. Yes?
It's okay for me. Yeah.
Okay.
So that would mean our next one would be on October 4th.
Excellent.
Okay, so it's Sunday, October 4th, and same time, 1 p.m. And it's the remainder of the European nihilism section, that is 21 through 29 inclusive, and anything you haven't done before up until then.
Thank you, Joe. If you forget to do your homework every week, we get 3 weeks.
Well, it's just
I
my
don't think the teacher
confusion.
will buy that, though.
You know, I take pride in actually doing it, and I diligently spent today. It's really quite nice the way I work it was Saturday morning, and I can knock off 25, 30, 40 pages just by being patient and working diligently from 7:30 a.m. reading. I've got a beautiful situation to read in. So, but this is a longer time. I have to do that like 8 mornings in a row.
Well, if you do 20 pages done, you have to do it 4 mornings. If you've got some past stuff to do.
Don't give me so much credit for diligence. But,
well, 4 out of 21. Let's put it that way. All right. Well, this was good. I will. When we ring off, I'll make the recording and I'll put it up and put a link for it here that is on the meetup site. And we'll see you guys again in 3 weeks.
Great.
Sounds good.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jason.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye. Where's my stop recording? There it is.